The light in the room is the colour of old ivory. It falls through a window hung with lace so fine you can see the garden behind it. A wash of pale green, the suggestion of roses not yet open, the slow turning of leaves in a wind you cannot feel from where you sit. You're very still. The house around you is very still. Whatever hour this is, it belongs entirely to the quiet. There is a fireplace across the room, and though no fire burns now, the stone of it holds a warmth from earlier, from last night, from some hour you were already sleeping through. The mantelpiece above it carries a clock that ticks once every second with the patience of something that has never been in a hurry. A small vase holds 3 white flowers whose names you do not need to know. They lean very slightly toward the window, the way all living things do, without effort, without intention. Somewhere in this house, there are rooms you have not entered yet, rooms with closed doors, with furniture draped in linen, with the specific silence of places where important things once happened. You do not need to go there. You are here, in this chair, in this light, and the story will come to you as gently as the morning comes, not all at once, but in layers, one thing at a time, each one softer than the last. Tonight, we are going back to another century, to houses larger than this one, to women who wore their wealth like a second skin and sometimes, when no one was watching, tried quietly to remove it. There were sisters, there was money, there was everything that money builds around itself to keep itself intact. And there were 2 women who found, each in her own way, that the architecture of a dynasty is a beautiful thing to look at from the outside, and a very particular kind of prison once you are born within its walls. Let the clock tick. Let the garden go on greening in the pale light beyond the lace. The story is long, and there is no hurry, and you are already, even now, beginning to drift toward the place where all stories eventually arrive, the quiet end of things, where nothing is urgent and everything is already resolved. Close your eyes if you like, or keep them soft against the ceiling, unfocused, letting the room blur at its edges. Either way is fine. Either way the voice will carry you where we are going. We are going to the Gilded Age. This is a phrase that Mark Twain gave to a particular period in American history, roughly the last 3 decades of the 19th century and the first few years of the 20th, and it means exactly what it sounds like. An age gilded over, bright on the surface, something harder underneath. It was a time when a small number of American families accumulated fortunes so enormous that the word fortune hardly contains them. Steel fortunes and railroad fortunes and oil fortunes, fortunes built on coal that came up black from the earth, on iron that was poured red hot into moulds in the middle of the night, on timber that fell from forests so vast they seemed to have no edges. The families who held these fortunes built houses to match. Not houses the way you might use that word, meaning a place with rooms and a kitchen and a door that locks at night. These were architectural statements. These were buildings designed by the finest architects of the age, filled with artwork purchased in the galleries of Paris and Rome, staffed by dozens of servants who rose before the family and went to bed after them, and lived their entire working lives inside the walls of someone else's world. You have perhaps heard of the Vanderbilts, or the Astors, or the Belmonts, or the Whitneys. These names still carry something when you say them, a faint shimmer, like a coin turning in the lamplight. In their time, these names were not merely famous, they were architectures. They were the names of systems, of dynasties, of complicated arrangements of money and marriage and social position that stretched across generations and were designed, deliberately, carefully, at great legal expense, to stretch across generations more. What does it feel like to grow up at the centre of a dynasty? Not at its founding, not in the era of the grandfather who built the railroads and accumulated the millions, who was rough-mannered and self-made and did not particularly care what anyone thought of him. But one generation later, in the era of the children who were born into the wealth rather than creating it, who were raised from birth to understand that they were the inheritors of something enormous, that the weight of all of it, the houses, the name, the social position, the expectations, was theirs to carry forward. This is a particular kind of childhood. Not a sad childhood, not an empty one. There were genuine pleasures in it, genuine warmth, genuine beauty, but a weighted one, a childhood conducted under the awareness of what was owed. But this is not a story about the men who built the fortunes. It is a story about the women who were born into them. Tonight, you're going to rest inside a story about sisters, about two women who grew up in the same enormous house, who breathed the same gilt-edged air, who wore the same kinds of dresses and attended the same kinds of parties, and were raised by the same kind of mother, a mother who believed, with a conviction that was almost architectural in its solidity, that the purpose of a daughter was to extend the reach of the family name by marrying the right kind of man. About what happened when those two women, inheriting the same expectations, the same pressures, the same gilded cage, made entirely different choices about what to do with the bars. One of them chose power, one of them chose love. Both of them for a long time chose to believe that the choice they had made was the right one. The story of what happened between them is a story about betrayal, but betrayal of such a slow and quiet kind that by the time it was complete, neither sister could quite say when it had begun. And the story of where they each ended up is a story about what the Gilded Age cost the women who were born at its centre, rather than those who built it. The names of the sisters were Edith and Consuelo. They were Vanderbilts, which in the 1880s and 1890s was one of the most resonant names in the English-speaking world. Their mother was Alva Smith Vanderbilt, later Belmont, a woman of formidable intelligence and formidable will, who had married into the Vanderbilt fortune, and who had spent the years since her marriage making the most of it, with a strategic thoroughness that the generals of her era might have recognized. Their father was William Kissam Vanderbilt, heir to a railroad fortune of staggering size, who was in many respects the background of the story, present, wealthy, and somewhat less interesting than the women who surrounded him. The story you're about to hear spans decades. It begins in a house on Fifth Avenue in New York City, in the era when Fifth Avenue was the address that told you everything about a family's standing in the world. It moves through Newport summers and London seasons and the Oxfordshire countryside and the south of France. It touches on some of the largest social changes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the end of the Gilded Age, the arrival of the Progressive Era, the fight for women's suffrage, the Great World Wars that reorganised everything, and at its centre, throughout all of it, are two women who knew each other before they knew anything else, who were shaped by the same forces, who made different choices, and who lived with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their very long lives. Let that settle for a moment. Let the clock tick. Let the lace curtain shift in whatever breath of air finds its way through the window frame. You have all the time you need, and we are only just beginning. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs only to very large houses. Not the silence of emptiness, which is thin and slightly anxious, but the silence of a place so fully furnished, so densely inhabited across so many rooms that sound itself gets absorbed before it can travel far. The carpets drink it, the heavy drapes at the windows take it in, the walls, plaster over brick, 3 feet thick in the old way of building, hold it inside themselves the way stone holds warmth, slowly, for a long time. This is the silence you would have found, on a morning in the early 1880s, inside the house that William Henry Vanderbilt built for himself and his family on Fifth Avenue in New York City. You would have found it despite the fact that something like 70 people lived and worked within those walls, servants rising in the attics before the light came, lighting fires in the rooms below before anyone came down to feel their warmth, a kitchen already producing, bread set to rise the night before, the range stoked, the first pots set to simmer with something that would not be ready until afternoon. And yet from the street, from the front parlour, from the hall with its marble floor and its gas fixtures still burning low from the night, the house was perfectly, composedly quiet. You are standing in that hall now. It is cool. The marble beneath your feet holds the night's chill in it, the way marble always does, regardless of how many fires are burning in the rooms above. The wallpaper is silk, a deep garnet red, with a pattern of small stylized leaves that you can feel with your fingertips, raised slightly from the surface. Run your hand along it. The sensation is faintly textured, faintly cool, like the underside of a broad leaf in autumn. The staircase curves up to your left, its banister a spiral of mahogany so smooth and dark it looks almost wet. At the top of the first landing a window faces east, and through it the early light of the city comes in the colour of a winter pearl. The smell of the hall is particular. It is the smell of cut flowers. There are always flowers in the hall, replaced daily by one of the undergardeners who brings them up from the conservatory on the ground floor. And beneath the flowers, the deeper smell of the house itself, furniture wax and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of wood that has been living in a warm interior for years, absorbing the residue of all the years before. It is a smell that you cannot reproduce in a newer house. It takes time. It takes the slow accumulation of seasons and occasions, and the particular chemistry of a building that has been inhabited long enough to develop its own interior atmosphere. This house, you should know, is not the grandest house on Fifth Avenue. It will not be the grandest house the Vanderbilts build, but it is, in this moment, in this decade, in this particular chapter of the story, the house that matters. Because it is the house where two girls are growing up, two sisters. Their names are Edith and Consuelo, and they have been born into a world so constructed around the idea of money and position, and the correct arrangement of both that they have never once in their short lives been allowed to think of themselves as ordinary. They are not, of course, ordinary. Ordinary is not a thing this family permits. Ordinary is what happens to other people, to the families on the streets below, to the city that hums and clatters and smells of horses and coal smoke beyond the walls of this protected world. Inside these walls, everything is arranged to reinforce a single, unwavering idea: that the Vanderbilt name is among the most important things that exist in the Republic of the United States of America, and that the daughters who carry that name carry it not as a gift but as a duty. Edith was the elder. She was born in 1867, the year after the end of the Civil War, into a family that was already in the process of becoming something unprecedented in American life, a dynasty with the ambition of an aristocracy, and none of the ancient bloodlines that European aristocracies had used to justify themselves. She had her mother's dark eyes, she had her father's steadiness. She was, from very early in her life, a serious child, the kind who listened more than she spoke, who noticed things that other people missed, who understood even before she had the words for it, that the world she had been born into operated according to rules that were not written down anywhere but were nonetheless completely binding. There is a quality of attention that belongs to serious children that is different from the quality of attention that belongs to serious adults. The adult's seriousness is organized, directed, channeled towards specific objects and specific purposes. The child's seriousness is more diffuse, more receptive. It is the seriousness of an instrument tuned to a wide range, capable of detecting things that more selectively focused instruments would miss. Edith had this quality. She sat in rooms and absorbed them. She sat at tables and absorbed the conversations occurring above her head. Conversations about money and about families, and about who had done what to whom, and what the consequences had been and what should be done about it. She stored these things. She used them later. Consuelo was younger by 4 years, born in 1871. She was named for a Cuban heiress, a friend of the family, as if naming her after one wealthy woman might help her become one too, or rather, help her marry one, since for a Vanderbilt daughter the goal was always the same. She was prettier than her sister, or so the photographs suggest, with a long neck and a quality of looking slightly beyond whatever was directly in front of her, as though she was perpetually searching for something that had not yet arrived. She was also more fragile, in the ways that the word fragile applied to daughters of the Gilded Age. Not physically weak, but sensitive to the pressure of expectation, in a way that her more armoured sister was not. Their mother was Alva. This is a name worth saying with some weight, because Alva Vanderbilt was not a woman who permitted herself to be a background figure in anyone's story, including her daughters. She had been born Alva Erskine Smith, of a Southern family that had lost its money in the war and its standing in the long humiliation that followed, and she had married William Kissam Vanderbilt with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had decided that she was going to restore what she had lost, but bigger and more permanent than it had ever been before. She was, by every account, formidable. She was small and broad-shouldered, and she moved through rooms the way a general moves through territory, assessing it, organising it, deciding what was useful and what was not. To understand Alva is to understand a great deal of what happens in this story. She was not a simple person. She was not simply a manipulative mother, or a social climber, or a woman who sacrificed her daughter to her ambitions, though she was, at various points, elements of all three. She was also a person of genuine intelligence and genuine courage, who had navigated a world that gave women of her generation very limited options, and had made herself Through force of personality and strategic clarity, into someone of consequence. She had built something. The question of what she had built it at the cost of is the question that the story will take a long time to answer. The house on Fifth Avenue was Alva's production as much as William's money. She had opinions about every room. She had engaged Richard Morris Hunt, the finest architect available, and she had told him what she wanted, and she had revised what he gave her until it matched the picture in her mind. The result was a house that other people came to look at the way they went to look at paintings, not to live inside, but to receive an impression of something extraordinary. Hunt was used to difficult clients. He had worked for the Vanderbilts before, and he would work for them again. He understood that what Alva wanted was not simply a house, was not, at the deepest level, a domestic space designed for the comfort of its inhabitants, but a demonstration of what wealth looked like when it was applied with full seriousness to the problem of impressing the world. The mahogany staircase, the silk wallpaper, the marble floors, the conservatory with its gas-heated glass panels casting perpetual greenhouse warmth over the palms and the cut flowers. These were all instruments of demonstration, playing their part in the continuous performance of having arrived. And inside this extraordinary performance 2 girls were being raised. They ate their meals at a table that seated 30 and was set for 12. They slept in rooms that had their own fireplaces and their own windows looking over gardens that were themselves the size of lesser estates. They had a governess and then tutors and then, in their adolescent years, access to the society that their mother had spent decades constructing around herself. They had dancing lessons and French lessons and lessons in deportment, in the management of household staff, in the correct way to enter a room and the correct way to receive a guest, and the correct way to pour tea into a cup held just so. The teacup matters. This is not a trivial detail. The way a cup is held, the specific angle of the handle, the exact degree to which the wrist is elevated, the particular quality of attention with which a woman accepts or refuses a second cup, was, in this world, legible. It was read by everyone in the room. It communicated things about breeding and confidence and the quality of one's upbringing that no amount of verbal assertion could substitute for. A cup held wrong was a small catastrophe. A cup held right was invisible, which is what everything in this world was supposed to be when it was done correctly. What they did not have, what became clear only later, only in retrospect, when the story of their 2 lives could be laid side by side and examined, was any education in the art of choosing. Because for Alva Vanderbilt's daughters, the important choices had already been made by someone else. The choice of where to live, how to live, whom to see and whom to avoid, these were managed. And the most important choice of all, the one that would determine the entire shape of a woman's adult life in this era and this world, the choice of husband, was, in Alva's philosophy, too consequential to be left to the daughters themselves. The education they received was, in every other respect, excellent. It was better than the education available to most women of their era, in most parts of the world. It gave them languages and music and history and the specific social competences that their world required. It gave them the ability to enter any room of consequence and to conduct themselves within it with confidence and grace. It gave them the capacity for independent thought, even as it declined to authorize them to act on that capacity in the areas that mattered most. This is a specific kind of contradiction, the giving of a tool while withholding the permission to use it for the most important purposes, and it produced in both of them a quality of intelligence that was real and recognized and regularly deployed, but always within limits that the intelligence itself could perceive. This did not seem to Alva cruel. It seemed like love. It seemed like the highest form of care a mother could offer, to apply her superior knowledge of the world to the problem of her daughters' futures, to ensure that they would not make the kinds of mistakes that came from following feeling rather than reason, from choosing a man who made the heart flutter rather than one who made the dynasty endure. Alva had reasons for thinking this way. She had seen what happened to women who chose badly. She had seen the consequences play out over years, sometimes over decades. She had seen women who had followed their hearts and found, on the far side of the following, that the heart had been, in the specific calculus of their world, wrong. What she had not fully considered, or perhaps had considered and decided did not alter the calculation, was this: that her daughters were not simply instruments of dynasty. They were also, quietly and persistently, people, and people, even the most beautifully constrained and carefully managed ones, have a way of developing interior lives that no governess can quite reach, and no arrangement of velvet and marble can quite suppress. The clock on the mantelpiece in the front parlour ticks. The morning light strengthens very gradually against the silk wallpaper. Somewhere in the floors above, two girls are sleeping still, Edith in her room, Consuelo in hers, and the story of what happens between them when they wake into their adult lives is a story that is, in this moment, still entirely unwritten. Let the hall be still. Let the marble be cool. Let the morning come in at its own pace, with no urgency and no alarm. The house is large enough to hold everything that is going to happen in it, and the night is not quite finished, and there is time enough for the story to unfold at the pace that a story of this kind requires. The pace of a life being lived, which is always slower than the pace of a life being summarized, and always richer, and always more thoroughly saturated with the smell of cut flowers and furniture wax, and the residue of all the seasons that have been passing through these rooms since the first morning this house was opened and the light came in. There was a schoolroom on the third floor of the house on Fifth Avenue, and it smelled of chalk and something sweet that came from a small pot of paste kept on the corner of the desk, used for mounting pressed flowers and map illustrations in the oversized portfolios that the governess kept lined up on a shelf. The windows of this room faced the back of the house, away from the street, and so the sounds that came through them were quieter. Not the clatter of carriages on Fifth Avenue, but the more muffled sounds of the garden, of birds in the ailanthus tree by the back wall, of a delivery being made somewhere in the alley below. You can almost smell the chalk if you let yourself. That cool, dry, slightly mineral smell that belongs to schoolrooms and nowhere else. And the wood of the desks, which has been polished so many times that it is as smooth as a river stone, reflecting a blurred version of the window light when you run your hand across it. The governess, there have been several, they tend to last 2 or 3 years before being replaced with someone who speaks better French or has more experience with music theory, is sitting at the larger desk at the front of the room. She has a pen, and she is marking exercises. The scratching of her pen is the room's steady rhythm, like a pendulum. The shelves along one wall hold the tools of the education being conducted here. There are grammars in French and German and Latin, their spines worn slightly at the top from being pulled out and replaced many times. There are books of history, a set of volumes on European monarchies, another on American founding figures, another on the geography of the world organized by continent, each continent's chapter beginning with a hand-drawn map. There are music books. There is a box of watercolour paints with a brush resting across its lid that has dried to a slight rigidity, the bristles holding the ghost of the last colour used, a faint blue, the colour of sky, or perhaps of the dress of some historical figure in an illustration that was painted from it. Edith and Consuelo sat at smaller desks, arranged not in rows, as they would have been in an ordinary school, but angled slightly toward each other, toward the governess, as though the room itself had been configured to suggest that everything that mattered was centred on this woman at the front who held the pen. This was, in miniature, how the entire household was arranged, everything angling toward the figure of authority at the centre. In the schoolroom, that was the governess. In the rest of the house, it was Alva. The subjects taught in this schoolroom were not exactly those taught in the public schools of New York, which in this era were crowded and underfunded and smelling of a different kind of chalk, the institutional kind, slightly damp, pressed too hard. In this room there was French, there was German, there was a great deal of history, but history of a particular kind, the kind that focused on the movements of courts and the lives of monarchs and the ceremonies of state occasions, because this was the history that would be useful. There was music, which meant piano, which meant hours of practice that Consuelo found tolerable, and Edith found genuinely interesting, approaching the keyboard with the same analytical patience she brought to everything. The piano was in the room adjacent to the schoolroom, a proper music room, with a better instrument than the upright that appeared in the schoolroom for basic instruction. The room smelled of rosin, and the particular slight mustiness of a room that is used specifically for one thing, and keeps, in its walls and its floors, the accumulated resonance of that one thing being done repeatedly. When Edith practiced, the sound moved through the wall into the schoolroom, where Consuelo sometimes sat with her exercises and half listened. The scales first, methodical, the same sequence repeated until the fingers found it without thought, and then the pieces, which were always something classical, always something with a European sensibility, nothing American, nothing popular, nothing that would have been heard in the streets below. There was also something that was never officially listed as a subject, but was nonetheless taught with great thoroughness and regularity. Call it the curriculum of consequence. It was the ongoing education in what it meant to be a Vanderbilt daughter, what was expected, what was permitted, what was absolutely not permitted, and what the failure to meet expectations would cost. This was not taught through lectures. It was taught through the daily experience of living inside a system that made its values visible in every choice about what was served at dinner and who was invited to call and which invitations were accepted and which were returned with a polite regret. Alva was the primary teacher of this curriculum, though she would not have recognized it as a curriculum. She would have called it simply the way things were. She taught it through the guest list she assembled for the parties she gave, parties that were social events in the way that coronations are social events, carefully choreographed exercises in the demonstration of position. She taught it through the judgments she made about other families, delivered in the carriage or at the dinner table, in the tone of someone pointing out a flaw in a painting. Not cruel, exactly, but definitive. That family has lost ground. That marriage was a mistake. That woman chose wrong. She taught it through the clothes she ordered for her daughters, which were made by specific dressmakers whose names carried meaning, and through the way she inspected those clothes when they arrived, and occasionally sent them back with corrections, because the making of a Vanderbilt daughter was a detail-oriented project that did not tolerate imprecision. She taught it through the social calls she permitted and the ones she declined, and through the brief explanations she sometimes offered for why one family was acceptable and another was not. Explanations that were always delivered in a tone that suggested the acceptability and unacceptability were not matters of opinion but matters of fact, as obvious and as fixed as the arrangement of the furniture. The girls absorbed this. Both of them absorbed it, though they absorbed it differently. Edith absorbed it the way a dry cloth absorbs water, thoroughly, without resistance, incorporating it into her own texture until the distinction between what she'd been taught and what she believed was no longer visible. She understood the system. She understood what was required. She was, in many ways, the daughter Alva had hoped to produce. Clear-eyed, disciplined, capable of managing the demands of a large establishment, and fundamentally aligned with the values that Alva had spent her life establishing as correct. Consuelo absorbed it differently, not less thoroughly, but with a layer of herself that the lessons could not quite reach. She understood what was expected. She was not, despite what later accounts sometimes suggested, naive or particularly defiant. She was simply the kind of person who felt things more than she organized them, who experienced the pressure of her mother's system as a physical weight on her chest, rather than as a useful organizational principle. She understood the curriculum of consequence. She simply could not make herself feel, in the private parts of herself that her governess and her mother never quite managed to enter, that the consequences outlined for her were the only ones that mattered. This distinction between the two sisters, between the one who internalized the system and the one who understood it without quite believing in it, is the quiet fault line that would, many years later, and after a great deal of gilded surface had been accumulated above it, become the crack through which the story of their lives would break open. But the crack is invisible now, in the schoolroom with its chalk smell and its steady pen, and the sound of the ailanthus tree and the light wind outside. It is so far below the surface of the morning that there is nothing in the room that would allow you to find it, nothing that would give it away. The governess sets down her pen. She has finished marking the exercises. She opens the French grammar to a specific page. The verbs of movement, the ones that require the auxiliary être rather than avoir, the ones that beginning French students find confusing because the rule seems arbitrary. She explains the rule. Her French is excellent. She was educated in Geneva, she has mentioned, though she does not discuss the details of her own background, which would be inappropriate. Her voice has the practiced quality of someone who has explained this particular rule many times before and has arrived at an explanation that delivers it with exactly the right amount of clarity and not quite enough emphasis to make it seem as though the rule is difficult. The governess sets down her pen. She has finished marking the exercises. She opens the French grammar to a specific page. The verbs of movement, the ones that require the auxiliary être rather than avoir, the ones that beginning French students find confusing because the rule seems arbitrary. She explains the rule. Her French is excellent. She was educated in Geneva, she has mentioned, though she does not discuss the details of her own background, which would be inappropriate. Her voice has the practiced quality of someone who has explained this particular rule many times before and has arrived at an explanation that delivers it with exactly the right amount of clarity and not quite enough emphasis to make it seem as though the rule is difficult. The French lessons were not merely about language, they were about signalling. In the world Alva was constructing around her daughters, the ability to speak French, to speak it well with a genuine accent and a real vocabulary, rather than the tourist's approximation, was a mark of civilization, the specific civilization that the Gilded Age admired most. France, and particularly Paris, was where beauty came from in this era, where the clothes were made, and where the paintings were purchased, and where the taste that distinguished the truly cultivated from the merely wealthy was understood to originate. A Vanderbilt daughter who could speak French fluently had access to a register of social life that a daughter who could not was shut out of. This was not a small thing. German was also taught, though with less urgency. German was practical. There were Germans everywhere in the New York of this period, Germans who had come over in the great migrations of the mid-century and who had, in the decades since, built businesses and households and communities that intersected with the Vanderbilt world in various ways. But German did not carry the social prestige of French. It was useful without being elegant, which meant it occupied a different position in the educational hierarchy, important enough to include, but not important enough to require the same level of mastery. The music was genuinely taught, not merely the production of technically correct sounds from a keyboard, but music in the fuller sense, the history of it, the theory of it, the ability to recognize and appreciate and discuss it with the specific vocabulary that a cultivated person was expected to command. Consuelo had a more natural musical ability than Edith. She heard things in music that Edith, for all her disciplined practice, could not quite access. This was a reversal of their usual positions relative to each other, and Consuelo felt it. The relief of being good at something without having to work at it, of the training and the natural ability pointing in the same direction for once. Edith takes notes. Her notebook is neat. The lines even, the letters formed with the precision of someone who takes the forming of letters seriously. The notes will be studied later, in the half hour before dinner, when she reviews the day's lessons with the thoroughness that her mother has established as the correct approach to one's education. Consuelo's notes are also neat, but with a quality of correctness that is slightly more effortful. The neatness of someone who has learned what neatness looks like and is producing it on purpose, rather than the neatness of someone for whom order is a natural and unstrained condition. The schoolroom is quiet now, except for the governess's voice and the scratch of the pen. The smell of chalk and paste and the faint green smell from the garden drifting in at the slightly open window is the smell of this hour, this room, this particular morning in the middle of the 1880s. It is the smell of an education being conducted with great care and great thoroughness in service of a vision of what these two girls are going to become. The vision is Alva's, of course. The schoolroom is Alva's. The governess is Alva's appointment. The curriculum, the French verbs and the piano pieces and the history of European courts and the studied management of the visiting card is Alva's design. The girls are in this room at this desk on this morning, the products of a very specific intention. They are being made. The making is careful, and the making is kind, in its own way. There is nothing cruel in the smell of chalk or the patient voice of the governess, nothing punishing in the arrangement of the desks or the view of the garden from the window. The care taken is genuine. The love behind the project is genuine. Only the project itself, the vision of what the finished product is supposed to be, is the problem, and the problem is not visible yet from here. From here, it is simply two girls at their desks on a morning, learning the things they have been given to learn in a room that smells of chalk and spring. Outside the window, above the ailanthus tree, the sky is whatever colour the morning has given it. Consuelo looks at it for a moment, not conspicuously, not in a way that the governess would notice as inattention, but with the quick private flicker of attention that a person gives to something they find genuinely interesting when they are in a situation that requires them to attend to something else. The sky is a clear, unremarkable blue. There is nothing in it that requires attention, and yet she is looking at it with an expression that a more careful observer than a governess might notice. Not longing exactly, but a quality of attention that goes beyond what is directly in front of her. Edith continues her exercise. Her pen moves steadily. Her French verbs are correct. Her handwriting is careful and even, each letter formed with the precision of someone who takes the forming of letters seriously. She does not look out the window. The sky is not what her lesson is about. The lesson is what her lesson is about, and when the lesson is over there will be another, and she will give that one the same steady attention. The room holds them both, the one whose eyes are on her page and the one whose attention sometimes slips just briefly to the sky. Both of them still, both of them present, both of them already becoming themselves. You have by now had some sense of the house. Let the house rest for a moment, and consider instead the world that surrounded it, the larger architecture that the house itself was embedded in, the social machinery that Alva Vanderbilt had spent the better part of her adult life learning to operate. New York society in the 1880s was not a vague and fluid thing. It was, by design, a system with clearly defined boundaries, rules of admission and exclusion, a hierarchy as intricate as anything in European court life, and at least one woman who functioned as its principal gatekeeper. That woman was Caroline Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, a distinction in the definite article that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of authority she held. Mrs. Astor lived in a house on Fifth Avenue not far from the Vanderbilts. This proximity of the very rich to each other was itself one of the features of this world, the way they clustered along the same streets as though warmth came from adjacency. Her ballroom was the size that mattered. It was said, and the saying had the quality of law, that her ballroom held 400 people comfortably, and this number, the 400, became the shorthand for New York society's inner circle. If you were not one of the 400, you were simply not. The number is precise, and its precision is part of its function. 400 is not a round number in the way that 500 is a round number. It carries in its specificity the implication of a real count, of actual deliberation, of a list that has been constructed and maintained with care. Whether the count was genuinely literal or merely approximately so is less important than the fact that the number was taken seriously, was treated by the people who shaped the world of New York society as a real and binding category. If you were inside it, you existed. If you were outside it, you were aspirational at best, invisible at worst. Alva Vanderbilt had spent years being, in Mrs. Astor's calculation, not quite one. The Vanderbilts had money, more money frankly than the Astors, but money alone had never been the point. The point was lineage, which the Vanderbilts lacked, and the point was social acceptance, which Mrs. Astor controlled, and the point was the particular quality of being recognized by the right people as belonging to the right world. The Vanderbilts were too new. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of the fortune, had been a rough-mannered, self-made man who had cared very little for the social niceties that Mrs. Astor valued. This roughness, or the memory of it, clung to the family name even a generation later, even after the money had been polished to an almost blinding degree. It is worth spending a moment on what this roughness meant, and why it persisted. The kind of social memory that Mrs. Astor maintained, the kind that kept the Vanderbilts outside the circle even after they had more money than anyone in it, is a specific and somewhat irrational thing. It has to do not with what a family is now, but with what it was before, with the accumulated reputation of prior generations, with the story that a name carries regardless of the current chapter. The Astors had arrived in America roughly the same way the Vanderbilts had, through commercial ambition, through the vigorous acquisition of resources, through the building of a fortune rather than the inheriting of one. But the Astors had arrived earlier, which meant the roughness of their origin had had longer to wear smooth, which meant the shine on their name had reached a different quality than the shine on the Vanderbilts. This is the logic of old money, which is not really a logic at all, but a genealogy. The transformation of the merely new into the acceptably old through the passage of enough time. Alva's great achievement was breaking this open. She did it with a party. This sounds like an understatement, but in the world of Gilded Age New York, a party could be a tactical operation of considerable sophistication, and Alva was a tactician of the first order. In March of 1883, she organised a costume ball in the newly completed Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, the chateau that she had designed with Hunt, the one that was itself a statement of arrival. The ball was the most elaborate entertainment New York had seen in a generation. 1,300 guests were invited. The rooms were decorated with a scale and density of flowers that required an entire railroad car to transport from the greenhouses of Long Island. The flowers were arranged in patterns that covered not merely the tables and the mantelpieces, but the walls themselves. Roses pinned in clusters, orchids trained along wires, garlands of something tropical and fragrant that had been brought at enormous expense from further south. The smell of the rooms on the evening of the ball was overwhelming in the specific way of an excess that has been deliberately calculated. Not the smell of a garden, which is diffuse and varied, but the concentrated smell of a statement which is focused and singular and impossible to ignore. The costumes worn by the guests had been ordered from the finest dressmakers in Paris and London, some of them weeks in advance, some of them at a cost that would have employed a family for a year. One guest came as the electric light, her gown lit from within by an early Edison installation that required a concealed battery. Another came as a Venetian princess from a Titian painting, the fabric of her dress reproduced from a museum study of the original canvas. Alva herself came as a Venetian noblewoman, in amber velvet with a peacock fan, and was by all accounts extraordinary. The tactical dimension of this was simple but effective. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Caroline, had been rehearsing a quadrille, a formal group dance, to perform at the ball. But Alva had not invited Mrs. Astor, and since Mrs. Astor had never formally called on Alva, that is, had never made the official social gesture of leaving a card at the Vanderbilt house, the gesture that constituted recognition, Alva could not, in the elaborate social grammar of the age, invite her. Mrs. Astor's daughter, desperate not to be excluded from the event of the season, prevailed upon her mother, and Mrs. Astor, understanding that she had been outmanoeuvred, left her card at the Vanderbilt house and sent her daughter's name to the invitation list. It was, in the parlance of military history, a decisive engagement. Alva had forced Mrs. Astor to come to her. She had used the party, the flowers and the costumes and the 1,300 guests, as a weapon, and she had won the battle that she had been fighting since she married into the Vanderbilt family. The 400 now included the Vanderbilts. The wall had been breached, and the daughters growing up in the house on Fifth Avenue were now definitively among the most eligible young women in New York society. Edith and Consuelo were children when the 1883 ball took place. Edith 16, Consuelo 12. Old enough to understand something of what had happened, young enough not to understand all of it. What they could see was the preparation, the weeks of activity in the house as the ball approached, the arrival of fabrics and flowers and the consultations with Hunt about the arrangement of the rooms, the measured anxiety beneath their mother's composed surface that was visible to anyone who lived in the same house as her, even if it was invisible to the world. And they could see the aftermath, which was the particular quality of triumph that Alva wore in the weeks following the ball, a satisfaction so thorough and so quietly contained that it had the quality of a temperature, a warmth that changed the climate of the house. What they were absorbing in these observations was something more than a lesson in social tactics. They were absorbing a model of how a woman of intelligence and ambition could exercise power in a world that formerly offered her very little. Alva had used the available tools, the house, the party, the social grammar of the card and the call, to do something that the available tools were not supposed to be capable of. She had changed the rules. She had, in the most literal possible sense, forced the person who controlled the gates to open them. This was a lesson with two possible readings. The first reading was about the effectiveness of working within the system, of mastering its tools so thoroughly that you could use them against their own limitations. The second reading was about the cost of that mastery, the years of watching and waiting and managing the humiliation of exclusion, the energy expended on the conquest of a social world rather than on the building of something else. Edith and Consuelo, growing up in the house that had been built for this battle, absorbed both readings. What they did with them was different. This is the context in which Edith and Consuelo came of age. Not simply in a large house with French lessons and good china, but in a world where social position was a resource that had to be actively maintained, where every party and every introduction and every alliance between families was a move in a game that never paused, and where the stakes, for a daughter, were nothing less than the entire shape of her adult life. The game had rules. The most important rule was about marriage. Marriage in this world was not primarily an emotional arrangement between two people who had found each other. It was a strategic arrangement between two families who had determined that their interests aligned. The daughter brought beauty, youth, a family name, and, in the Vanderbilt case, considerable money. The husband brought lineage, social position, perhaps a title. The families negotiated the terms. The children were, in varying degrees, consulted. The consultation was rarely substantive. You understand this better, perhaps, if you think about it in terms of what a woman of this class could own. Under the laws of the period, a married woman had very limited rights to property. What she brought into a marriage, her money, her possessions, her inheritance, became, in most states and in most circumstances, her husband's. She could not enter into contracts in her own name. She could not sue or be sued in her own right. She existed, in the eyes of the law, under the umbrella of her husband's legal identity, and this arrangement was considered not as a constraint but as a form of protection. The husband would manage things. The husband would be responsible. The wife would be managed and provided for. The irony, which certain women of the period were beginning to articulate, was that this protection looked remarkably similar to imprisonment, when the protector was not, in fact, protective. When the arrangement made the wrong man the manager of everything a woman had, the protection became something else. But the articulation of this irony required vocabulary that the world of New York society in the 1880s was not ready to provide, and the daughters of the Vanderbilts were being educated in many things but not in this. The irony, which certain women of the period were beginning to articulate, was that this protection looked remarkably similar to imprisonment, when the protector was not, in fact, protective. When the arrangement made the wrong man the manager of everything a woman had, the protection became something else. But the articulation of this irony required vocabulary that the world of New York society in the 1880s was not ready to provide, and the daughters of the Vanderbilts were being educated in many things but not in this. There were women who were articulating it, however, in the margins, in the periodicals, in the speaking halls where the early suffragists were making their case, with a patience and a persistence that the comfort of their opponents could afford not to notice. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been making the argument for decades. Susan B. Anthony had been making it. Their voices reached the Vanderbilt daughters filtered and attenuated, the way all subversive ideas reach the daughters of the establishment, present in the air but not in the curriculum, available to anyone looking for them, but not placed directly in the hands of the people whose lives would have benefited most from finding them early. Alva would eventually find them. This is one of the stranger chapters in the story of the Vanderbilt family, the woman who had orchestrated the most famous forced marriage of the Gilded Age becoming, in her later years, one of the suffragist movement's most significant benefactors and most visible advocates. But that chapter comes later, in the 1880s, in the world of the schoolroom and the visiting card and the ballroom decorated with a railroad car's worth of flowers. The vocabulary for the critique of the system was not yet Alva's vocabulary. It was simply, still, the system. And the daughters were being raised inside it, learning its language and its manners and its particular understanding of what a woman's life was for. The machinery of society hums and turns in the evenings when the lamps are lit and the carriages assemble along Fifth Avenue, and the doors of the great houses open to admit the guests who have come to be seen in the correct company. It hums and turns quietly now, as you listen, as the story settles around you. The machinery is always running, even in the small hours, even when the guests have gone home and the servants are clearing away the last of the glasses and the flowers have begun to droop in their arrangements. It runs on money and on name and on the particular social energy of a world that has decided its own importance and has never, in all its years, seen any compelling reason to revise that decision. Let it run. Let the evening go on. Let the lamplight lay itself in warm rectangles on the polished floors of a dozen great houses along the avenue, and let the city outside them be the city it always is, large and various and entirely indifferent to the social dramas being conducted above it. There is time for all of it. The night is long, and the story has barely begun to show its shape. There is a word that recurs in the letters and diaries of Gilded Age women with a frequency that tells you how much of their lives it consumed. The word is season. Not the season of the year, not autumn or spring, but the social season, that compressed period of parties and balls and dinners and calls that ran roughly from October through June in New York, and then migrated, in the summer months, to Newport or the Hudson Valley or the great estates of Europe. The season had a rhythm, and once you understand the rhythm, you understand something essential about the world these women lived in. It was, in every practical sense, a full-time occupation. Not paid work. Women of this class did not work, in the sense that required leaving the house and receiving wages, but an occupation nonetheless, requiring a level of organisation and preparation and performance that would exhaust anyone who was made to think clearly about it. Consider a single week in the season, in the mid-1880s, when Edith and Consuelo were old enough to be introduced to society. Edith first, then Consuelo, in the careful sequential order that propriety required. You might begin your week on Monday with a morning of calls, not the kind of calls that involve actual conversation, but the formal ritual of leaving a card at the doors of households with whom you wish to be understood as maintaining social relations. Your footman carries the card tray, you sit in the carriage. Sometimes you're received, more often the butler takes the cards and notes that you called, and this noting is itself the point. The cards are printed on heavy stock, in a typeface that is modest and clear. Your name, rendered without flourish. The name of your house, if you are the mistress of one. The specific size of the card matters. Calling cards have precise dimensions that vary by the caller's social position, and the people who receive them read these dimensions before they read the name. A card slightly too large suggests someone who has not been long enough in the world to know the correct dimensions. A card slightly too small might suggest an affectation of modesty that is itself a form of social commentary. The correct card is correct, which means it requires no comment at all. Tuesday perhaps there is a luncheon, a small affair, 12 or 14 women, the table set with the second best china because the best is reserved for dinners. The food is elaborate and largely uneaten, because eating enthusiastically is not done in this kind of company, because enthusiasm in general is a quality that suggests insufficient self-discipline. There is a great deal of conversation about other people, who's been seen, where, with whom, and what this suggests about the state of their marriages, their finances, their social standing. The conversation is conducted in a register of careful indirection. No one says plainly that a family has lost money, that a marriage is unhappy, that someone has made an error of social judgment. These things are suggested, implied, half said, and then half retracted, communicated in the gaps between what is said and what is not said. A woman who said these things plainly would be considered coarse. A woman who said nothing at all would be considered dull. The art of the social conversation, as practiced at these luncheons, was the art of saying what was meant without saying it, of communicating information while maintaining the form of discussing something else entirely. Wednesday and Thursday are for receiving, for being at home between certain hours, so that those who wish to call may do so and find you present, which is the courteous version of this ritual. The parlour is arranged for it. There are flowers on the table and small cakes on a plate, and a maid stationed near the door to take the cards of those who arrive and show them in. You sit in a particular chair, at a particular angle to the light, wearing particular clothes. Not your grandest, but not your plainest either. The middle register, the one that says I am always thus, that this is effortless, that the whole arrangement of myself and my house and my afternoon is simply the natural condition of a person like me. The lighting in the parlour on receiving days is carefully managed. Not too bright. Bright light is unforgiving, and a woman who is receiving has, by the end of the afternoon, received enough people that unforgiving light becomes a liability. Not too dim. Dim light suggests something to hide. The correct light is the light of a good fire and 2 lamps at considered distances, producing a warmth that is flattering without being dramatic, that is simply the light of a comfortable, well-appointed room in which nothing unfortunate is happening. Friday might be a drive in the park, not exercise exactly, but the performance of leisure, which requires as much preparation as actual leisure and accomplishes different things. The carriage is brought around, the horses are the ones that look well together. You wear something that travels well in an open carriage, that does not crumple or gather dust in an unbecoming way. You go at a pace that permits others to see you and be seen by you, and the seeing and being seen is a complex exchange of information about who is well, who is unwell, whose colour is good and whose is bad, who has perhaps not had a restful winter, who has on the other hand arrived into the season looking entirely renewed. Central Park in the 1880s is full of this kind of seeing and being seen. The carriage drives along the park roads have a quality that is particular to this era. The horse's shoes on the packed gravel, the slight swaying of the carriage body, The smell of horse and leather and the late autumn earth of the park's planted areas. The grass still holding some colour even as the trees have gone bare. Other carriages pass and you exchange inclinations of the head. Not quite bows, not quite nods, but the specific minimal gesture of social recognition that takes place between people who know each other well enough to acknowledge each other, and not so well that anything more extensive is required. The weekend brings larger events. A dinner party on Saturday, 30 or 40 covers, the table gleaming with crystal and silver, the food in courses that follow the correct sequence and are served at the correct intervals. The soup first, always. The soup establishes a pace, gives everyone something to attend to, creates the initial warmth and the initial conversation that will carry the evening forward. Then the fish, then the entree, then the meat, then the game if it is the season for game, then the salad, then the desserts, which arrive in a procession that signals the end is in sight without quite bringing it. A ball on Sunday, or rather the aftermath of a ball, the returning from one in the small hours of the morning, the careful descent from the carriage, the removal of the evening's accessories in the dressing room with the help of a lady's maid who has waited up and who does not show on her face the fact that it is past 2 in the morning. The lady's maid's face is one of the great accomplishments of the Gilded Age domestic economy, a face trained to neutrality, to a service that is perfectly invisible, to the quality of presence that allows a woman to be helped without feeling helped, to simply experience the assistance as a natural condition of things rather than as something requiring acknowledgement. This was the season. This was the life that Edith and Consuelo were being prepared for, the life that their education was scaffolding toward, the life that all of the French verbs and the piano practice and the lessons in deportment and the carefully managed social calendar of their girlhood had been designed to equip them for. Edith took to it in the way that seemed natural for her, with a competence that was never surprising because it was simply the extension of the competence she brought to everything else. She understood the rhythms of the season, and she moved within them with an ease that was the product not of effortlessness but of preparation so thorough that it produced the appearance of effortlessness. She knew which families to call on and in what order. She knew the correct weight of a visiting card and the correct angle at which to offer it. She knew what to say at a luncheon and what to leave unsaid. She had absorbed all of this from the same source she had absorbed everything else, from careful attention to the woman who set the standard. The world of the season was a world of information, and the management of information was as important as any other kind of management. Who knew what, and when they knew it, and from whom? This was the intelligence network of the Gilded Age, and it ran on the same channels as the social life itself. The morning call was not merely a courtesy, it was a data-gathering operation. The luncheon was not merely a meal, it was a briefing. The drive in the park was not merely exercise, it was a survey of the current state of the social landscape, conducted from the elevated position of an open carriage with an unobstructed view of anyone who happened to be doing the same thing. Edith understood this with particular clarity. She had inherited from Alva not the hunger for conquest that had driven the 1883 ball and the campaign against Mrs. Astor, but the underlying intelligence that had made the conquest possible, the ability to see the social world as a system, to identify its pressure points, to understand where information was located and how it moved and what it could be used for. This intelligence, applied not to conquest but to maintenance, was the instrument with which Edith governed her social world. She did not seek to change its terms, she sought to understand them more completely than anyone else, and to operate within them with a precision that looked from the outside like grace. Consuelo, by contrast, had been given the education for this world but not the appetite for it. The preparation was complete, the instincts were not. She could conduct a morning call with perfect form and emerge from it feeling that she had been performing a role in a play she had not written and did not entirely understand the purpose of. She could sit at the correct angle in the parlour on a receiving afternoon and arrange her face in the correct expression and say the correct things to the people who came to call, and all of this would be done well, and none of it would feel like something she was actually doing. It would feel like something being done through her, by the machinery she had been trained to operate. This is the difference between a person who inhabits a role and a person who performs it. Edith inhabited, Consuelo performed, and the difference was not merely a matter of temperament, it was a consequence of the specific understanding each of them had reached about whether the world they were operating in was genuinely theirs, or merely one they had agreed to work within. Edith had, in her quiet way, claimed it. Consuelo had not, or rather Consuelo's claim had been overridden before she could make it. Newport in the Summers was the season's grandest chapter. The cottages, this word in the vocabulary of Gilded Age Newport, means something that requires a moment to sit with. The cottages of the very wealthy lined Bellevue Avenue and the cliffs above the Atlantic, and they were not cottages in any sense that the word ordinarily implies. They were mansions, most of them, and some of them were the largest private residences in the country. The Breakers, which the Vanderbilts built on the Newport cliffs in the early 1890s, had 70 rooms. Its great hall had a ceiling 45 feet above the marble floor. It was heated by 4 separate furnace systems and cooled, in summer, by the Atlantic wind that came in through the windows that faced the sea. Newport in the Summers was the season's grandest chapter. The cottages, this word in the vocabulary of Gilded Age Newport, means something that requires a moment to sit with. The cottages of the very wealthy lined Bellevue Avenue and the cliffs above the Atlantic, and they were not cottages in any sense that the word ordinarily implies. They were mansions, most of them, and some of them were the largest private residences in the country. The Breakers, which the Vanderbilts built on the Newport cliffs in the early 1890s, had 70 rooms. Its great hall had a ceiling 45 feet above the marble floor. It was heated by 4 separate furnace systems and cooled, in summer, by the Atlantic wind that came in through the windows that faced the sea. The use of the word cottage for these structures was itself a social performance, a performance of modesty that was, in its way, more extravagant than the performance of grandeur would have been. To call Marble House a cottage, to call the Breakers a cottage, was to occupy a register of understatement so extreme that it functioned as its own form of assertion, that the people who lived in these buildings were so thoroughly above the requirement of impression that they could afford, ironically, to describe their magnificence in the vocabulary of the humble. It was, in the taxonomy of Gilded Age social performance, a very high move, the move of someone who has won so completely they no longer need to claim victory. The Newport Cliff Walk in the evenings, when the dinner parties were being assembled and the carriages were beginning their circuits of Bellevue Avenue, had a quality that belonged specifically to this combination of the enormous natural world and the enormous human project sitting at its edge. The Atlantic on one side, the real Atlantic, grey-green and cold even in July, with the smell of salt and kelp and open ocean in the wind that came off it. The great houses on the other, the marble and the limestone and the iron gates and the gas lamps just beginning to be lit in the windows of the salons where the evening's entertainment was being assembled. In between, the narrow path and the occasional figure moving along it toward one destination or another, with the sea wind pulling at their clothes and their hair, and the sound of the ocean making itself heard above every other sound. The sea was the one thing at Newport that was not part of the social machinery, or rather, it was adjacent to the machinery, tangential to it. You could hear it from the terraces of the great houses, could smell it in the air, could see it from the rooms that faced the cliff walk. But the sea itself, being wild and salt-flavoured and indifferent to the guest lists of the season, existed in a different register from the parties and the drives and the yacht races. It was simply there, large, grey-green in the afternoon light, moving in its own rhythms entirely regardless of what was happening on the cliff above it. But even at Newport in the summers, even with the ocean visible from the piazza and the lawn extending green and perfect toward the cliff's edge, the season continued. The machinery does not stop for the ocean. The ocean is simply the backdrop against which it runs. Let the ocean be there now, at the edge of the cliff. Let the Atlantic go on being what it always is, vast and indifferent and beautiful in the specific, slightly frightening way that very large bodies of water are beautiful when you stand at their edge and understand for just a moment how small you are in relation to them. Let the evening come in off the water, carrying salt and coolness, and let the story breathe for a moment, here at the cliff's edge, before we go back inside to where the machinery is waiting. By the time Consuelo Vanderbilt was 17 years old, her mother had a list. Not a written list. Alva was not a woman who committed her most important strategies to paper, but a mental list, a ranked and annotated catalogue of the European aristocrats who were, in her assessment, appropriate candidates for her younger daughter. The list had criteria. The family had to be old. The title had to be real. not one of the decorative accommodations that minor European courts sometimes offered in exchange for American money. The finances of the family, though this was a consideration Alva was prepared to manage, had to be such that the marriage would not look to the world like a purchase. The last criterion was the most important and the most delicate. The phenomenon of wealthy American girls marrying European aristocrats was, by the 1880s and 1890s, well established enough to have attracted a somewhat ironic name, the Dollar Princess arrangement. The English press had been writing about it for years, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with a tartness that suggested they found the whole business slightly gauche, a commercial transaction masquerading as a love match. Alva was aware of this perception. She found it irritating. She did not intend her daughter's marriage to look like a transaction, even if it was, at its structural core, exactly that. England was where the search was conducted. In the summers of the early 1890s, Alva organised a series of extended visits to London and to the English country houses of families she had identified as suitable, and she brought Consuelo with her. These visits were social occasions in the English sense, house parties lasting a week or more, with shooting and riding and elaborate dinners, and the slow, careful assessment of potential alliances that the English gentry conducted with a subtlety that was, in its own way, as systematic as anything Alva had devised. England was where the search was conducted. In the summers of the early 1890s, Alva organised a series of extended visits to London, and to the English country houses of families she had identified as suitable, and she brought Consuelo with her. These visits were social occasions in the English sense, house parties lasting a week or more, with shooting and riding and elaborate dinners, and the slow, careful assessment of potential alliances that the English gentry conducted with a subtlety that was, in its own way, as systematic as anything Alva had devised. The English country house party was an institution of considerable refinement. It had evolved over generations into a form that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was genuinely social, genuinely pleasant, a gathering of agreeable people in beautiful surroundings with excellent food and the specific leisure of a week away from the demands of the city. But it was also, always, something more. It was the place where alliances were assessed, where the compatibility of families was explored over the course of days rather than the minutes of a formal introduction, where young people of the right backgrounds were placed in proximity and allowed to demonstrate, through the natural course of shared meals and walks and evenings by the fire, what they were actually like. The English were, in this enterprise, practitioners of a subtlety that Alva recognised and respected. They did not arrange marriages with the direct, almost commercial explicitness of Alva's approach, did not sit down with settlements and lawyers and work out the terms in advance of the emotional component. They created the conditions for certain kinds of meetings and then stepped back and allowed the meetings to take on their own momentum. The result, as often as not, was the same as Alva's more direct method. But the process felt different, and in a world where the appearance of having chosen freely was part of what was being sold, the feeling mattered. England in the summer is a particular kind of beautiful, not the bright assertive beauty of the Mediterranean which demands attention, but a softer thing, the beauty of green hills under a sky that is almost always in some form of negotiation with clouds, of country houses set in parks that have been arranged over centuries by people who understood how to make a landscape serve as a frame. The house parties took place in houses that were older than any American house, houses with histories visible in their architecture, with rooms that had been added in different centuries by different sensibilities, with gardens that had been planted so long ago that the trees were genuinely enormous, casting shade that covered whole lawns. Consuelo did not know precisely that she was being assessed, or rather she knew it in the abstract. She was not without intelligence or perception, but the knowing existed at a level somewhat removed from her daily experience of these visits, which was the experience of fresh air and green English countryside, and the particular pleasure of being in a world that was different from the one she'd grown up in. England was quieter than New York. The houses, though grand, were older, less aggressively polished, carrying their history in their walls in a way that the Vanderbilt houses, for all their magnificence, did not quite manage. The English people she met were, in their way, easier, more ironic, less earnest about their own importance. She met people during these visits. She met young men, sons of lords, younger brothers of dukes, officers in the guards regiments whose manner was a specific combination of casual and formal that she found interesting. She met one young man in particular during the visit of 1893, and he was not on her mother's list. He was not a duke. He was not in the hierarchy of English aristocratic titles, anything very much at all. But he was, in the vocabulary that Consuelo would have used if she'd been asked, kind. Genuinely, straightforwardly kind, in a way that had nothing to do with her name or her money or her prospects. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He was American, not English, which removed him entirely from Alva's calculations. He was handsome and easy in his manner, and he talked to Consuelo as though what she thought and said were genuinely interesting to him, which was not the universal experience of being talked to in ballrooms where most men were simultaneously speaking to you and scanning the room over your shoulder for someone more useful. She liked him. More than liked him. The feeling that developed between them was by every account real, not the manufactured attachment of a girl who had been told to feel something, but the actual unrehearsed thing. There is a quality of the actual unrehearsed thing that is different from everything else. You cannot produce it on purpose. You cannot create it through the correct performance of the correct emotions in the correct situations. It arrives when it arrives, in circumstances that are frequently inconvenient and sometimes entirely inappropriate, and it carries with it a recognition that is almost physical, the recognition of something that you did not know you were waiting for until it appeared. Consuelo, who had spent her whole life being educated in the performance of appropriate emotions in appropriate situations, found in this recognition something that her entire upbringing had not prepared her for. When Alva found out, she was not pleased. She was not merely displeased in the way that a mother is displeased when a daughter shows poor judgment about something minor. She was displeased in the strategic sense, in the sense of a person who has been playing a long game with a great deal at stake and has discovered that one of the essential pieces has moved in a direction not specified in the plan. Rutherford was forbidden. The attachment was declared inappropriate. The meetings, which had been occurring in the careful, managed way that a girl of Consuelo's class could manage meetings, in drawing rooms with other people present, in the parks, at parties, were ended. Consuelo wept. This is recorded. The weeping was not brief or easily consoled. It went on for weeks, in the private rooms of the houses they occupied, while the social machinery continued its rounds in the public rooms below. Alva acknowledged the weeping as a fact and did not allow it to alter the plan. Her daughter was young. Young feelings were strong. They were also, Alva believed, with the conviction of someone who had chosen reason over feeling in her own life, and found the choice correct, temporary. The feeling would pass. What would not pass was the advantage gained or lost in the marriage her daughter made. And so the list was consulted again, and the name at the top of it was the Duke of Marlborough. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, holder of one of the oldest titles in England, Master of Blenheim Palace, great-great-great-great-grandson of the first Duke for whom Blenheim had been built as a gift from a grateful nation. He was 23 years old, rather short, rather slight, possessed of a jaw that portraits later made dignified, and that in life was simply prominent. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly warm person. He was dutiful and conscious of his position, and not without intelligence, but the warmth that Winthrop Rutherford had offered Consuelo was not a thing the Duke of Marlborough was equipped to provide. What he was equipped to provide was Blenheim Palace, and the entire apparatus of one of England's greatest aristocratic families, and this, in Alva's calculation, was sufficient. More than sufficient. It was in fact the exact thing that all of the years of social manoeuvring and party-giving and European travel had been directed toward. The negotiation of the marriage was conducted between lawyers and family representatives on both sides, in the manner of a treaty between governments. The terms were explicit. Consuelo brought an immediate settlement of $2.5 million in cash paid by Alva from the Vanderbilt fortune. She brought additional securities generating income of $100,000 per year, a sum that, in 1895, could maintain an estate of some size without financial anxiety. The Duke brought Blenheim and his name and the oldest aristocratic credential available in English society. Consuelo, at 19 years old, did not want to marry the Duke of Marlborough. This is one of the most plainly documented facts in the whole complicated story of the Vanderbilt sisters, because Consuelo later wrote about it herself, in a memoir published decades afterward, with the quiet, even tone of someone who has had many years to find the words for something that at the time could not quite be named. She had cried in her room on the morning of her wedding, She had begged her mother. She had said, or words to this effect in the version she later wrote, that she did not love him. The morning of the wedding was grey, which New York mornings in November frequently are, a flat, overcast grey that is not quite raining, but carries the suggestion of rain that has not yet decided to arrive. The carriages arrived at the Vanderbilt house on Fifth Avenue. The dress, which had been made in Paris and had arrived in a series of boxes of graduated sizes, was put on. The veil was arranged. The bouquet was brought, white flowers, orchids and lilies of the valley, the smell of them filling the dressing room with the specific sweetness of cut flowers in an enclosed space, a sweetness that under other circumstances might have been pleasant, and under these circumstances was simply overwhelming. Alva's response to Consuelo's distress was, in the version Consuelo later told, to proceed with the ceremony. The church was packed with 1,200 guests. The street outside was lined with thousands of spectators. The bride wore white satin with a train measured in yards. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and whatever she was feeling was not visible on her face. The face that 1,200 guests saw in the church at St. Thomas's on the 9th of November, 1895, was the face that a lifetime of education in the performance of the correct emotion in the correct situation had produced. Composed, beautiful, entirely unreadable. There is a form of compliance that looks like acceptance. Consuelo gave it on her wedding day, gave the composed face and the white dress and the steady walk down the aisle, and the world that watched her received it as acceptance and reported it as such. The newspapers described the wedding with the enthusiasm appropriate to a spectacle of this magnitude. The social commentators noted the beauty of the bride and the suitability of the match. The guests, who numbered 1,200 in the church and many thousands more in the street, saw a young woman entering into a great marriage with the composure of someone who understood her own good fortune. None of them could see under the composure what the composure was containing. Not distress of a dramatic kind. Consuelo was not, in those final hours before the ceremony, weeping or refusing or threatening the kind of scene that would have made the wedding impossible to proceed with. She was simply somewhere else, somewhere in herself, in the private room of a self that had been managed and shaped and redirected for the past several years, and that still, despite everything, retained the knowledge of what it wanted and the awareness that what it wanted was not this. Edith was at the wedding, of course. She was among the witnesses. She would have seen the composure as the composure it was. She knew her sister well enough to read the face beneath the expression, and whatever she made of what she saw there, she said nothing about it that has survived the record. The thing a sister does not say, in a moment like that, is sometimes the most telling thing about the relationship. She was present. She witnessed. And she continued watching in the way that Edith always watched, adding what she saw to the store of information that she was, in her careful, methodical way, making sense of. This is where one version of the story would end. The deal made, the cards played, the game concluded in Alva's favour. But the story of the two sisters is not finished here. It has barely begun. Because Edith had been watching all of this, the strategy, the weeping, the negotiation, the wedding, with the careful, unreadable attention of someone who's absorbing lessons that she is going to need later. Let the carriages roll away from St. Thomas's Church. Let the guests disperse into the November afternoon, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The city goes on, indifferent to the specific fate of one girl in one carriage, and the story goes on with it. Blenheim Palace sits in the Oxfordshire countryside near the village of Woodstock, and the first thing you notice when you approach it, the thing that the landscape itself seems designed to prepare you for, is its scale. Not the scale of a large house, which your eye can accommodate by comparison with the houses you have seen before. The scale of something else entirely, of a public monument that has decided for complicated historical reasons to call itself a home. The approach is through a park designed by Capability Brown, who was perhaps the most celebrated landscape architect of the 18th century, and who approached the land surrounding Blenheim with the same ambition that the architects had brought to the building itself. There is a lake, artificial, created by damming a small river, that you see before you see the house. The lake is large enough to have its own quality of light, its own small weather. Swans move across it with the proprietary ease of creatures who have been there much longer than you. Beyond the lake, across a stone bridge wide enough to drive a carriage across 4 abreast, the palace rises from the trees. It is built of honey-coloured limestone that turns gold in the afternoon light and pale as cream in the morning. The stone has a particular quality that you notice most in the hours before noon, when the eastern light catches it at an angle that makes the surface seem to breathe, the colour shifting very slightly as a cloud moves across the sun, changing from warm to cool and back, as though the stone is alive to the light in a way that newer buildings, with their more uniform surfaces, are not. This is not an illusion. Old limestone does respond to light differently than new materials do, and Blenheim's stone has been responding for 300 years. It has towers and colonnades and a central block of such enormous proportions that the people you can sometimes see moving along its terraces appear, from any distance, to be very small people indeed. The palace was built in the first decade of the 18th century as a gift from Queen Anne to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, in recognition of his victory over Louis XIV at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. The gift was intended to be commensurate with the achievement. It very nearly is. This is where Consuelo Vanderbilt came to live in November of 1895. She arrived on a November afternoon, in the grey light that belongs to English autumns, with the park already stripped of its summer colours and the lake reflecting a sky the colour of old pewter. The carriage from the railway station would have brought her through the great gates of the park and along the drive, and she would have had, for the first time, the experience of approaching Blenheim as its duchess rather than as a visitor. The experience, by her own later account, was extraordinary and slightly cold at the same time, the kind of beauty that impresses and then continues impressing until the impressiveness itself becomes a form of pressure. The distinction between visitor and mistress matters. As a visitor, Blenheim is extraordinary in the way that great public buildings are extraordinary. You move through it with the slight unreality of someone moving through a space that exists on a scale too large for ordinary human purposes. As its mistress, Blenheim became something different. It became a responsibility. It became quite specifically her problem. The palace required, at this period, roughly 40 household servants to keep it functioning at the level its status demanded. There was a housekeeper who managed the female staff, and a butler who managed the male, and below them a hierarchy of under-housekeepers and ladies' maids and kitchen maids and footmen and grooms and gardeners that was itself a kind of small institution. They all worked to maintain a building that had been built in the early 18th century, and that had, over the intervening 2 centuries, developed the complicated needs of a very large, very old thing: roofs that leaked in specific places, chimneys that drew improperly in certain winds, floors that required particular treatments, rooms that were habitually cold regardless of how many fires were lit. The coldness of Blenheim in winter is one of the things that appears most consistently in accounts of life there. The palace was not designed for warmth. It was designed for grandeur, and grandeur in the early 18th century was achieved through high ceilings and vast windows and rooms proportioned for ceremony rather than habitation. The Great Hall, 80 feet long, 45 feet high, paved in stone, was beautiful and completely impossible to heat to any temperature that a person in outdoor clothes would have found comfortable. Fires were lit in it anyway, in the enormous fireplaces that lined its walls, and the fires were themselves impressive, but their warmth rose directly to the ceiling and remained there, and the people standing in the room below felt the grandeur and the cold simultaneously. Consuelo was 19 years old when she became responsible for this. She had been educated at considerable expense and with considerable thoroughness in the management of a great house, in the correct way to organise a dinner party, to manage servants, to maintain the social life appropriate to a family of their position. But the education had been calibrated for an American great house, and Blenheim was not an American great house. It was something older and more encrusted and governed by traditions that were not written down anywhere, but were nonetheless absolutely binding on the people within its walls. Consuelo was 19 years old when she became responsible for this. She had been educated at considerable expense and with considerable thoroughness in the management of a great house, in the correct way to organise a dinner party, to manage servants, to maintain the social life appropriate to a family of their position. But the education had been calibrated for an American great house, and Blenheim was not an American great house. It was something older and more encrusted and governed by traditions that were not written down anywhere, but were nonetheless absolutely binding on the people within its walls. There was a quality of historical weight to Blenheim that went beyond its age and its size. The building was not merely large and old, it was freighted with specific, documented, celebrated history, with the victory at the Battle of Blenheim, with the figure of the first Duke, with the particular tradition of Churchills and their relationship to the English nation that had been maintained across 2 centuries of political and military life. To be the Duchess of Blenheim was not merely to manage a large estate. It was to serve as the living representative of all of this history, to maintain by one's presence and behaviour the dignity of an institution that regarded itself as genuinely significant to the national story. This was a role that Consuelo, 19 years old and not yet fully formed as a person, was expected to inhabit from the moment of her arrival. Not to grow into, to inhabit. The palace did not offer a transitional period, a time to find one's footing, a space in which mistakes might be made without cost. It required, from the first evening dinner, the full performance of a dignity that she had not yet had time to develop. She developed it. Over the years, with the intelligence and the discipline that were genuinely hers, she developed it. But the process of developing it inside a building that was simultaneously requiring it of her was one of the more demanding things that a person of her age and her particular circumstances could have been asked to do. There were traditions about meals, not just what was served or how it was served, but when it was served, in what order, with what specific ceremonial of announcement and seating and precedence at the table. There were traditions about the arrangement of the house for specific types of entertainment, the shooting party, the political weekend, the family gathering at Christmas, each requiring a different configuration of rooms and staff and social behaviour. There were traditions about the park, about the specific paths that were maintained for specific purposes, the specific trees that were not to be touched, the lake that was managed in a specific way by specific people, according to specific understandings that went back generations. The social life required of a Duchess of Marlborough was also particular. There were obligations to the local county, to the families in the surrounding countryside who had maintained relationships with the Churchills across generations, and who expected those relationships to continue in their accustomed form. There were obligations to the political world, because the Churchills were not simply an aristocratic family, but a political one, with deep roots in the Conservative Party, and expectations that their great house would function as a centre of political entertainment. There were obligations to the royal household, to the ceremonial round of court life that was, in this era, still a genuine mechanism of social organisation. The social life required of a Duchess of Marlborough was also particular. There were obligations to the local county, to the families in the surrounding countryside who had maintained relationships with the Churchills across generations, and who expected those relationships to continue in their accustomed form. There were obligations to the political world, because the Churchills were not simply an aristocratic family, but a political one, with deep roots in the Conservative Party, and expectations that their great house would function as a centre of political entertainment. There were obligations to the royal household, to the ceremonial round of court life that was, in this era, still a genuine mechanism of social organisation. The political world was, in the years of Consuelo's time as Duchess, going through one of its periods of considerable movement. The late 1890s and the first decade of the new century were years of debate and reform, about the rights of labour, about imperial policy, about the fundamental question of how much power should be held by the hereditary aristocracy, and how much should move toward democratically elected bodies. These debates were not abstract to Consuelo. She had opinions on them. She had, through her philanthropic work and her direct experience of the conditions of the rural poor on and around the Blenheim estate, come to opinions that were in some cases more progressive than those of the people she was expected to entertain at her table. The dinner party as a political venue was one of the primary tools of governance in this era. Policy was made in the long hours after the meal, when the men moved to the smoking room and the women moved to the drawing room, and the serious conversations began. As the hostess, Consuelo had influence over who was at the table, over which voices were in the room, without having any formal standing in the conversations that followed. This was a form of power, and she used it. Not always visibly, not always in ways that would have been recognised as power by the men who exercised it in more explicit forms. But in the aggregate, in the accumulated choices about who was invited and who sat next to whom, and what subjects were introduced over the soup, she exercised a real shaping influence on the political life that moved through her house. But the money was, as it turned out, urgently needed. Blenheim was not merely large, it was expensive. The estate had been running at a deficit for years before the marriage. This was one of the reasons the Duke had agreed to what was, when analysed without sentiment, a commercial arrangement. The Vanderbilt settlement allowed the estate to restore what time and insufficient income had allowed to deteriorate. Roofs were repaired, rooms that had been closed for decades were reopened, staff numbers that had dropped were increased, the park was maintained properly again, the gold and the stone gleamed. But the gleaming was not comfort. The restored rooms were beautiful in the way that very carefully preserved things are beautiful, with the beauty of the maintained artifact rather than the beauty of the inhabited place. Consuelo moved through them with the competence that her upbringing had given her, and the patience that her character supplied, and something that her own later accounts describe as a persistent low-grade loneliness that the competence and the patience could manage but could not eliminate. There were children. George, the heir, was born in 1897. Alva was born in 1898. They were both dark-eyed and, in their early childhood, beautiful in the specific way of children who are being very well taken care of by a great number of people. Consuelo loved them. This is not in doubt. The love she felt for her sons was, in a life that contained very little that was purely her own, perhaps the thing that was most completely and most unambiguously hers. She fought, in the managed way available to a duchess, to be more present in their lives than the conventional arrangement between children and aristocratic parents allowed, the conventional arrangement being one in which children were managed largely by nannies and governess, and presented to parents at specific hours in a specific way, clean and prepared and carrying the evidence of their care. She wanted more than this. She sat with them longer than convention required. She was interested in what they were learning and how they were finding the world, in the ways that a mother who had grown up with a mother less interested in such things than in the management of social position sometimes is. She was trying, in the private rooms of the enormous palace, to make something human-sized, something that belonged to her and not to the argument being made by the walls around her. The letters she wrote in the early years of her marriage, some of which survive in archives on both sides of the Atlantic, give a picture of someone actively managing this situation with the intelligence and the resources she had available. She wrote to friends in America. She wrote to her family. The letters are careful. They do not say directly what they contain, but the carefulness of them is itself the story. A person who is content writes letters with a certain ease, a certain willingness to say what is actually happening. A person who is managing writes letters in a different register, descriptive, active, attentive to everything except the central thing. She also read in those early years at Blenheim. The palace had a library, a magnificent one, lined floor to ceiling with volumes collected over 3 centuries by people who had the resources to collect whatever they found interesting. She spent time in it. She found, in the books, a kind of conversation that the palace's human inhabitants did not quite provide. A conversation with people who had thought seriously about things, and put the thinking into language that could be carried from one century into another, from one set of circumstances into entirely different ones, and still be understood. This is one of the things books are for. She was 21 years old, in one of the most magnificent rooms in England, reading herself into a larger world than the one the room was designed to contain. Let the park be still now. Let the pale Oxfordshire stone hold its colour in the last of the afternoon light. The swans on the artificial lake tuck their heads beneath their wings as the evening comes on, and the long drive leading up from the gate is empty, and somewhere inside the enormous building that reflects the darkening sky in its tall windows, lamps are being lit one by one in the rooms where the evening will be spent. The fires in the great hall are doing their work, rising toward a ceiling too high to warm. The cold of the stone is doing its work too, patient and indifferent. The cold of a building that has been cold for 300 years and intends to go on being cold for 300 more. While Consuelo was crossing the Atlantic to take up residence at Blenheim, Edith was in New York, and she was watching. She'd watched everything. The search for a suitable match, the visits to English country houses, the management of Consuelo's unfortunate attachment to Winthrop Rutherford, the negotiation of the settlement, the wedding. She had been present for most of it and informed about the rest. And she had, in the particular way that was most essentially Edith, been drawing conclusions. The conclusions were not sentimental ones. Edith was not the kind of person who drew sentimental conclusions. She had watched her younger sister be moved, by a combination of maternal pressure and social machinery, from a girl who had some capacity for choosing her own life into a position where that capacity was largely irrelevant. She'd watched the mechanics of this, the sequence of decisions by which a family's strategic interest could be made to override an individual's preferences, and she had understood it with a clarity that was not available to Consuelo, who was too close to the thing to see its shape. There is a particular clarity that comes from watching rather than being watched, from being the sister who is not the principal object of attention, the one who is not being managed and shaped and deployed toward a specific outcome. Edith had, by virtue of birth order and temperament, largely escaped the intensity of Alva's matrimonial ambitions during the period when Consuelo was the primary focus of them. She had moved through those years as an observer, which meant she had had the opportunity to see what the process looked like from a position that Consuelo had never been afforded. What Edith understood was this, that the system her mother had used on Consuelo could also be used on her, that the same logic that had sent her younger sister to Blenheim Palace could, if she was not careful, send her somewhere she had not chosen. The question was what to do about it, how to navigate a world that ran on the assumption that daughters were to be placed rather than to place themselves, without either surrendering to the assumption or fighting it in ways that would cost her everything. Her answer, characteristically, was neither surrender nor open defiance. It was something more strategic, more aligned with the part of herself that was Alva's daughter, as much as she was anyone else's. She would work within the system. She would use the machinery of the season and the social round and the careful management of introductions not as something that was being done to her, but as something she was doing. She would choose, but she would choose in the idiom of her world, in the language it provided, in the forms that were available to her. This is a form of agency that is easy to underestimate from the outside. It does not look like freedom, not the kind of freedom that later generations learn to recognize, the kind that involves openly claiming the right to determine one's own life. It looks from the outside like compliance, but compliance can be a container for a great deal of internal deliberation, and Edith's compliance contained more of it than its surface suggested. She was, in her own way, as strategic as her mother. She had simply decided to be strategic in a different direction, not toward the acquisition of position and social victory, but toward the acquisition of something that served her own life. The something was harder to name than social position. It was something more like sufficiency, a life that was adequate to the needs she had actually identified in herself, rather than the needs the world had specified for her. The man she chose was Ernest Iselin. He was not a duke. He was not the kind of spectacular catch that Alva had arranged for Consuelo. He was a New Yorker, from a respectable family, not at the apex of the social pyramid, but solidly embedded in the upper middle stratum of it, the kind of family that appeared regularly on the acceptable lists, and whose members were to be met at the correct events, without anyone finding anything remarkable about their presence. He was, in the ways that Edith had decided mattered to her, good, good-natured, good-humoured. Good in the specific sense of being someone who would make a life that worked rather than a life that glittered. Alva was not entirely pleased. Alva had had, in some part of her planning, ideas about what Edith's marriage might look like, ideas that were not so specifically formed as the Consuelo project, but ideas nonetheless, built from the general conviction that her daughter should marry up, should consolidate rather than simply maintain the family's position. Ernest Iselin was a consolidation of a very modest kind. He was not a bad match. He was simply not the spectacular kind of match that Alva's ambitions had trained her to expect. But Edith was older than Consuelo had been at her wedding. She was in her mid-20s, which in this era was not precisely old, but was old enough to have given her a certain gravity as a woman who had not yet been placed, and she had managed the conversation with her mother in a way that Consuelo had never managed to do, not by weeping, which Edith found unproductive, not by arguing, which would have engaged Alva on her strongest ground, but by presenting the choice as already made, in the tone of a person informing rather than requesting, with a warmth toward her mother that made the informing seem like sharing something rather than asserting something. Alva, who was sharp enough to recognize when she had been outmaneuvered, and who perhaps recognized in her elder daughter the strategic intelligence that was most fundamentally her own inheritance to give, accepted the fait accompli with better grace than she might have shown in earlier years. The wedding was arranged. It was not in scale or social spectacle anything like the Consuelo Marlborough ceremony. It was a family wedding, conducted in the correct style for a family of their position, but without the international attention and the 1,200 guests and the street lined with spectators. The wedding was in spring, which felt appropriate for a marriage that was, at its heart, a practical thing made with clear eyes rather than a monument built for maximum impression. The church was modest by Vanderbilt standards. The flowers were white, roses, lilies of the valley, the same combination that had appeared at Consuelo's wedding, but without the scale, without the statement. The guests were the people who actually knew the family rather than the assemblage of witnesses that a truly spectacular social event required. Edith was composed on her wedding day, not composed in the way that Consuelo had been composed, not holding something back with visible effort, not keeping the face still against the pressure of what was happening under the surface, composed in the more straightforward sense, genuinely settled, genuinely at ease with the decision she had made. This was a distinction that those who knew both sisters recognized. One composure was the maintenance of a surface. The other was simply the condition of a person who had decided what she wanted and had obtained it. The marriage was, in the ways that Edith had calculated it would be, workable. This word deserves a moment of consideration, because it can sound like a diminished thing, like the settling for less that happens when someone gives up on a grander aspiration. But Edith had not given up on a grander aspiration. She had decided that the aspiration itself required revision. She had decided that a workable life, conducted on her own terms as much as the terms of her world allowed, was worth more than a spectacular life conducted on someone else's. Workable, moreover, has a durability that spectacular often lacks. Spectacular things tend to require constant maintenance, constant attention, constant performance, constant vigilance against the diminishment that comes when the spectacle cannot be sustained. Workable things tend to run. They have the self-sustaining quality of arrangements that have been designed with the available materials in mind rather than against them. A workable marriage in the Gilded Age sense was not nothing. It was in fact a considerable achievement, rarer than the marriages that were arranged with the greatest fanfare and celebrated with the most elaborate ceremonies. Workable, moreover, has a durability that spectacular often lacks. Spectacular things tend to require constant maintenance, constant attention, constant performance, constant vigilance against the diminishment that comes when the spectacle cannot be sustained. Workable things tend to run. They have the self-sustaining quality of arrangements that have been designed with the available materials in mind rather than against them. A workable marriage, in the Gilded Age sense, was not nothing. It was in fact a considerable achievement, rarer than the marriages that were arranged with the greatest fanfare and celebrated with the most elaborate ceremonies. The Eastlins were, by the standards of the Vanderbilt world, modest people. This word, modest, requires some calibration, because by the standards of almost anyone else, they were very comfortable indeed. They had houses and servants, and the particular quality of ease that belongs to people who have never needed to worry about the fundamental costs of living. But modest, in Alva's vocabulary, meant not at the summit, meant not the title, not the palace, not the international coverage in 2 continents newspapers. Meant, essentially, ordinary. Ordinary in the way that only the very wealthy can be ordinary. Which is to say, not at all ordinary by any external measure, but not exceptional by the measure of their own world. Edith moved into this modest, workable life with the competence that was her primary characteristic and the intelligence that was its engine. She organized her household. She established her social position. She built, over the first years of her marriage, a place in New York society that was not spectacular, not the kind of position that got written about in the papers the way Consuelo's did, but that was, in its own way, secure. The people who mattered in New York knew who she was and what she was worth. They respected her judgment. They came to her table and to her parties with the confidence of people who knew what they were walking into. This is no small thing to have built, and Edith built it characteristically by understanding the material she was working with, the social landscape of a New York that was, by the time of her marriage, already beginning to change, already showing the first faint signs of the pressure that would, in the following decades, reorganize it entirely. She understood that the position she was building would need to be a position capable of adapting, because the fixed positions of the Gilded Age were not going to remain fixed forever. She was not wrong about this. This was not a decision that appeared dramatic at the time. It appeared, in fact, rather quiet. A girl of a certain family making a marriage of a certain kind, which was what girls of that family had always done. But the decision was, in retrospect, a departure from the template. The template was Consuelo, placed, managed, deployed in the service of the family's strategic ambitions. Edith had looked at the template and had, very quietly, very deliberately done something else. The something else had consequences that neither Edith nor anyone else could have fully anticipated at the time, because the world of the Gilded Age, for all its apparent solidity and permanence, was in the process of changing in ways that were not yet visible from inside it. The fortunes that seemed inexhaustible were beginning to show their limits. The social system that seemed immutable was beginning to encounter the pressures that would, in the following decades, fundamentally reorganize it. Edith, settled into her workable marriage, was in a better position than most to observe these changes as they arrived. She had enough distance from the centre of her family's drama, not being at Blenheim, not being the focus of the international press coverage that followed Consuelo everywhere, to pay attention to the larger movements of the world. She had a husband who was present in the ways that a husband in this era was present, at dinner, at the social events, in the general vicinity of the household. She had, in other words, a life that was her own in ways that Consuelo's was not. Edith, settled into her workable marriage, was in a better position than most to observe these changes as they arrived. She had enough distance from the centre of her family's drama, not being at Blenheim, not being the focus of the international press coverage that followed Consuelo everywhere, to pay attention to the larger movements of the world. She had a husband who was present in the ways that a husband in this era was present, at dinner, at the social events, in the general vicinity of the household. She had, in other words, a life that was her own in ways that Consuelo's was not. The ordinary quality of this life was its own kind of achievement. Ordinariness is undervalued in historical narrative, which gravitates toward the dramatic and the exceptional, and tends to treat the maintenance of a stable and functional life as the absence of a story rather than as a story in itself. Edith's life was, in this sense, systematically underrepresented in the family's public narrative, because the family's public narrative was organized around Consuelo, around the spectacular marriage and the spectacular divorce and the remarkable second act in France. Edith was the background against which Consuelo's story was legible. This is a specific form of contribution that backgrounds always make, and that backgrounds are never thanked for. She built friendships that lasted. The people Edith knew in her middle years were, in many cases, the same people she had known in her early 20s. The continuity of a life conducted in one place, in one social world, without the disruptions of dramatic departures and reinventions. This continuity is its own kind of wealth, not the kind that appears in ledgers or settlement documents, but the kind that appears in the richness of relationships that have had time to become genuinely deep. People who have known you for 40 years know things about you that people who have known you for 5 cannot know. Edith had, at her table and in her drawing room, people who had this kind of knowledge of her, and she of them. For now, let the evening come. Let Edith's house settle into its night sounds, the cooling of the building as the fires die back, the small adjustments of timber and plaster that a house makes when the heat of the day withdraws. Let the city outside go on with its own business, indifferent to the particular choices being made within these walls. The two sisters are, at this moment, in different countries, in different circumstances, moving through the early years of their adult lives with the different energies of people who have arrived at different arrangements with the same world. Both arrangements are going to be tested. Both arrangements are going to reveal, in the years ahead, what they are actually made of. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you... The new century arrived, as new centuries do, without drama. In New York on the night of December 31st, 1899, there were parties and fireworks and the particular collective feeling of a moment that feels more significant than it can quite explain. But the morning of January 1st, 1900 looked very much like the morning of January 1st, 1899, and the social machinery that ran the world of the Vanderbilt family ran on, as it always had through the turning of the year. But changes were in progress that the fireworks could not quite illuminate. The America that had produced the Gilded Age, the explosive industrial America of the last 3 decades of the 19th century, when fortunes were made at a speed and scale that had no precedent in human history, was changing into something different. The progressive era was beginning, that long complicated period of reform and labour organisation and regulatory activism that would, over the following 2 decades substantially reorganized the relationship between great wealth and the public that lived alongside it. The income tax arrived in 1913. The great fortunes were not, after that, going to grow in quite the same way they had grown. The enormous sums that had built the houses on Fifth Avenue and the cottages at Newport had been accumulated in a period when federal taxation on income was not a feature of American life, when a family that earned a great deal could keep a great deal, when the compound growth of invested capital could proceed without the interruption of annual government claims. After 1913, the arithmetic changed. The change was gradual rather than sudden, but it was a change that pointed in one direction, and only one direction, and the direction was toward less. The social world was changing too. The 400 was still the 400, technically, but the ground beneath them was shifting in ways that required a different kind of attention to maintain one's footing. Immigration was transforming the cities. New money from new industries, oil, electricity, the automobile, was creating new families with the ambition and the resources to press against the walls of the existing social structure. The children of the old families were, in the first decade of the new century, beginning to make marriages that would have been unthinkable in their parents' generation. They were marrying for reasons that included, and sometimes prioritized, things other than dynasty. This context matters for understanding what was happening to both sisters in the years after the turn of the century, because what was happening to them was not simply a private drama of a family managing its internal affairs. It was also a story about how the world that had produced them was beginning, very gradually, to produce something different. A world in which the assumptions that governed their lives were no longer quite as fixed as they had seemed. At Blenheim, Consuelo was managing. The word managing has appeared before in this story, and it will appear again, because it is the most accurate word for what a certain kind of Gilded Age woman did with her life. Not living it so much as managing it, organizing it, maintaining it in a state of sufficient functionality that its appearance was acceptable and its mechanisms continued to run. Consuelo was a skilled manager. She had been educated to be one. But managing Blenheim and managing a marriage that had never contained the thing she had given up in order to make it was a different project than managing a household that was also, in however constrained a sense, one's own. She had grown, in the years since the wedding, into her role in ways that the nervous 19-year-old on the morning of her wedding could not have predicted. She was, by the first years of the new century, a genuine social force in England. Not simply the rich American duchess who had arrived with Vanderbilt money to restore the palace, but a woman of recognized intelligence and political interest and social conscience who had made herself, through the deliberate application of her own formidable capacities, someone that English public life took seriously. She became interested in social reform, in the conditions of the working poor, in the education of rural children, in the housing conditions of the families who lived in the villages on the Blenheim estate. This interest was not, in this era and class, unusual. Many aristocratic women of the period became involved in philanthropic work, partly out of genuine concern, and partly because it was one of the few venues outside the home where a woman of her station could exercise consequential judgment. But Consuelo's engagement with it was more serious than the conventional philanthropic gesture. She had opinions that were not conventional. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She was, in a word, inconvenient, in the productive sense of the word, the sense in which inconvenience is sometimes the precondition of actual change. She sat on committees. She testified before parliamentary commissions on housing conditions. She visited the houses she was trying to improve and talked to the people who lived in them, directly, in the way that American women of her generation sometimes approach things that English women of her class were not expected to approach, with the expectation that what the people in those houses thought and needed was itself relevant information. This was not a self-evident proposition in the world of English aristocratic philanthropy, which tended to approach the problems of the poor with the conviction that the people who understood the problem best were the people who had sufficient education and social perspective to see it clearly, which meant, broadly, the people who lived in houses like Blenheim. The Duke was not without appreciation for this. He was not an unkind man, but he was also, by temperament and by the training of his class, not a person who found inconvenience comfortable, and the specific quality of Consuelo's inconvenience, her directness, her tendency to arrive at conclusions that departed from what the existing system recommended, her American willingness to say what she thought in rooms where the English preference was to imply, was a quality that the marriage had no particular mechanism for accommodating. They had arrived, by the middle of the first decade of the century, at a coexistence that was civil and managed, and not without genuine mutual respect, but that was also increasingly clearly not a marriage in the fuller sense of the word. They were two people sharing a palace and raising children and meeting their social and political obligations, and, underneath all of that, two people who had never found in each other the thing that makes an arrangement between two people into a genuine partnership. The sons they had together were, by this period, growing up inside the palace in the particular way that children grow up inside large institutional households, with a degree of emotional distance from their parents that the size and formality of the household produced, and with their own private negotiations of the family's complexity. The sons were heirs. They were, from the moment of their births, the future of the dukedom, the people for whose sake the Vanderbilt fortune had been introduced into the Marlborough line, the people who would carry the title forward into the next generation and the one after that. Consuelo loved them with a particularity that the memoir makes clear, not the managed, performed love of a woman going through the motions of maternal duty, but the real love of a person who had found, in her children, something that was genuinely and completely hers. The sons they had together were, by this period, growing up inside the palace in the particular way that children grow up inside large institutional households, with a degree of emotional distance from their parents that the size and formality of the household produced, and with their own private negotiations of the family's complexity. The sons were heirs. They were, from the moment of their births, the future of the dukedom, the people for whose sake the Vanderbilt fortune had been introduced into the Marlborough line, the people who would carry the title forward into the next generation and the one after that. Consuelo loved them with a particularity that the memoir makes clear, not the managed, performed love of a woman going through the motions of maternal duty, but the real love of a person who had found, in her children, something that was genuinely and completely hers. The work she was doing in London and in the villages round Blenheim was, in a way she might not have quite articulated at the time, the work of a person who has found their vocation. Not the vocation that was assigned to her at birth, not the vocation of duchess, of great lady, of American heiress who had successfully converted her family's fortune into European title and social position, but the vocation that had been waiting, underneath the assigned one, for the conditions that would allow it to emerge. She was, in these years of social reform work, using the intelligence and the energy and the organizational capacity that her education had given her toward ends that she had chosen. This was a different experience from using those same capacities in service of the institution she had been married into. She was also in these years beginning to understand the limits of what the institution could offer, not in a dramatic way, not with a sudden revelation, but in the gradual, accumulating way of a person who has been paying attention, who notices, over the course of years, that the things they are doing that feel most essentially theirs are the things that exist at the greatest remove from the formal requirements of their role, and who begins to draw the conclusions that this observation implies. The conclusions were slow, they were responsible and careful and managed in the way that all conclusions had to be managed in a world where the cost of drawing them too quickly or too publicly was very high. But they were forming. In New York, Edith was watching. This is not entirely metaphorical. She was, in the years after the turn of the century, in regular correspondence with Consuelo, and the letters between them, some of which survive, give evidence of a relationship between two sisters that was by this point more complicated than sibling affection usually allows for. Edith had not been the agent of Consuelo's marriage. She had been a witness to it, younger enough to have been largely outside the negotiations, old enough to have understood what was happening. The marriage had not been her doing, but she had not opposed it. She had, in the way of a Vanderbilt daughter educated to work within the system, accepted it as one of the system's outcomes. The question of what Edith felt about Consuelo's situation, about the life that the marriage had produced, is a question that the letters address only obliquely. They are careful letters, written in the register of their time and class, where directness about private suffering is not a convention. They are letters that discuss practical matters, the children, the household, the social engagements, and between the practical matters, in the spaces between what is said, there is sometimes something else. Something that might be sympathy, and might be judgment, and might be the specific complex feeling of a person watching someone else live out the consequences of a situation that they themselves narrowly avoided. Because Edith had, in some sense, avoided it. Not the situation of an unhappy marriage. Ernest Islin was not making her unhappy exactly, but the situation of having been placed. She had placed herself within the available vocabulary, and the difference between the two, between being moved and choosing to move, was a difference that she knew, in her bones, was real. Whether Consuelo knew it too, whether she could identify the specific nature of what had been done to her and what had been done differently to her sister, is not something the letters address directly. What the letters do address, increasingly as the decade progresses, is the future. Both women were thinking about it. The world they had grown up in was demonstrably in the process of becoming something else, and the question of what that meant for them, for their households, their children, their social positions, their sense of what their lives were for, was one that neither of them could avoid for long. What the letters do address, increasingly as the decade progresses, is the future. Both women were thinking about it. The world they had grown up in was demonstrably in the process of becoming something else, and the question of what that meant for them, for their households, their children, their social positions, their sense of what their lives were for, was one that neither of them could avoid for long. The children they were raising occupied a peculiar position in this transition. The children of the Gilded Age's great families were inheriting a world that was, at the moment of their inheritance, in the process of becoming something different than what their parents had built for them. The fortunes were somewhat smaller, adjusted for the new taxation. The social machinery was somewhat looser, the gates somewhat more open. The absolute certainties that had governed their parents' lives, about what kind of person was acceptable and what kind was not, about what constituted success and what constituted failure, about the relationship between money and respectability, and the specific social standing each of these things conferred. These certainties were becoming, by the first decade of the new century, somewhat less certain. The children navigated this with the adaptive strategies of each generation, which are always partially the strategies their parents taught them, and partially strategies their parents would not have recognized. They married people their grandparents would not have met at the correct parties. They pursued occupations that their great-grandparents would have considered unsuitable for people of their class. They built lives that were organized around slightly different principles than the lives they had been raised inside, without quite abandoning those lives' fundamental assumptions about what constituted a life well lived. Edith watched this adaptation in her own children with the same analytical patience she brought to everything. She did not find it alarming. She found it, in the way of a person who has always understood that systems are tools rather than truths, simply interesting. The evidence of a world reorganizing itself in the way that worlds periodically do, dropping what no longer works and substituting what might. She made her own adaptations. She was, by this point in the story, very good at adaptations. The changes that were arriving were not all obvious from inside the lives being lived. Looking back from a century's distance, the trajectory of the Gilded Age and its end is clear. The arc of it is visible. The pressure points that would eventually cause it to fracture are identifiable. But from inside 1905 or 1907, the trajectory was much less certain. The world seemed, from day to day, to be roughly continuous with the world of the previous decade. The houses were still there, the dinners were still being given, the social calendar still turned with its customary regularity. The fact that all of this was in the process of changing was knowable in the abstract, but not yet from inside the machinery, fully felt. The morning light comes through the windows of whatever room you have settled into for this story, and the light is the light of a new century. Still the same quality of light, still the same warmth of it on the wall opposite the window, but carrying in it, as all light eventually does, the evidence of change. Let it fall. Let it lie on the floor in its long, quiet rectangle. Let the story breathe for a moment before it moves forward into the years when the changes that have been gathering will begin to arrive in earnest, one after another, too quickly now to be managed with the same measured patience that served in the years before. The separation of Consuelo and the Duke of Marlborough was not a sudden event. It was a slow thing, like the withdrawal of water from a tidal flat, gradual, inevitable in retrospect, barely visible in the moment of its happening. It occurred, in the technical sense, in 1906, when the couple formally separated and Consuelo returned to London with her sons. The palace was maintained, the title was maintained, the legal form of the marriage was maintained for a further 15 years, with a patience that tells you something about the complexity of ending an arrangement that had been constructed with such elaborate legal and social machinery. To understand why it took 15 years from separation to divorce, you have to understand the legal and social structure of aristocratic marriage in Edwardian England. Divorce, by the standards of that world, was not simply a legal procedure, it was a social catastrophe, a rupture in the fabric of the institution that the class had built itself around. Even a separation of the kind that Consuelo and the Duke arranged, civil, managed, publicly unembarrassing as such things could be, carried with it a stigma that required management. The divorce, when it came, required the additional demonstration that the marriage had failed on terms that the church could accept. This took, in Consuelo's case, the form of an annulment inquiry, an inquiry into whether the marriage had been validly entered into in the first place, which was a more complex question than it appeared, given the circumstances in which it had been arranged. The divorce itself, and the actual formal dissolution of the marriage, did not come until 1921. By then, Consuelo had been living a life that was, in all practical ways, her own for over a decade. She had an apartment in London. She had her philanthropic work, which by this point had expanded and deepened, and was no longer simply the conventional charitable engagement of a great lady, but something more like a genuine vocation. She had friends, people she had chosen, rather than people the machinery of her position had placed her among. She had, in small increments over a long period of years, been recovering the self that had been deferred at 19. The London apartment is worth pausing on for a moment, because it represents something specific and important in the geography of Consuelo's life. An apartment is not a palace. An apartment is not a house. It is a private space of manageable scale, with rooms that are sized for a single person's daily life, rather than for the performance of a great family's obligations. The apartment she took in Mayfair had good light. This mattered to her by all accounts, and a view of the street below, with the ordinary movement of London life visible from the windows. Carriages giving way to the new motor cars, pedestrians going about their various purposes, the city being itself, indifferent and busy, outside the glass. She lived in that apartment with a freedom that was new to her. Not freedom in the abstract declarative sense of a person announcing their liberation, but the practical daily freedom of someone who wakes up in the morning and makes small decisions that are entirely their own. What to have for breakfast, when to go out, whom to see, how long to stay. These decisions seem trivial from the outside. From the inside of a life in which the decisions of this kind have been made by institutional momentum rather than personal preference for as long as you can remember, they are not trivial at all. They are the substance of a life. The philanthropic work she threw herself into in these years reflected something real about her character, something that had been present in her but suppressed or redirected during the Blenheim years, when the scale of the institution she was managing and the requirements of her role had consumed the energies that might otherwise have gone into more personally chosen work. She cared about poor housing. She cared about children's education, particularly the education of children in rural areas who had limited access to it. She cared, with the specific intensity of a person who has experienced the consequences of having no say in the fundamental decisions of her own life, about the conditions that produced people who had no choices. She also had Jacques Balsan, who entered her life in this period with the particular quality of presence that a person has when they arrive at exactly the right moment. Not the right moment in some predetermined or fated sense, but the right moment in the sense of the moment when a person has become ready for them. He was French. He was an aviator, which in the decade of the First World War and the years immediately surrounding it, was a vocation with a specific quality of romance. Not the manufactured romance of fiction, but the actual romance of early flight, which was genuinely dangerous and genuinely extraordinary, a thing that had been impossible for all of human history until very recently, and that was now, through the application of mechanical ingenuity and a certain quality of fearlessness, becoming possible. He was not wealthy in the sense that Consuelo was wealthy. He was comfortable, in the French upper-middle-class sense, a sense that involves good food and good wine and good conversation, and a certain style of life that is organized around pleasure rather than obligation, that prioritizes the quality of a given afternoon over the maintenance of an institutional position. He was pleasant-mannered, easy in his manner, and he made Consuelo laugh. This detail, that he made her laugh, appears in the memoir with a specificity that suggests it mattered as much as any of the more obviously significant facts about the relationship. She had not laughed enough in the years at Blenheim. They married in 1921, the same year the divorce was finalised. They lived between Paris and a house in the south of France, and made a life that was comfortable and warm and entirely chosen, every element of it the result of a preference rather than an obligation. They travelled, they entertained, they grew old together, in the unhurried way of people who have arrived at contentment without having expected it, and who do not take it for granted. They married in 1921, the same year the divorce was finalised. They lived between Paris and a house in the south of France, and made a life that was comfortable and warm and entirely chosen, every element of it the result of a preference rather than an obligation. They travelled, they entertained, they grew old together, in the unhurried way of people who have arrived at contentment without having expected it, and who do not take it for granted. What does contentment look like in a life that had, for its first 30 years, contained so little of it? It looks, in Consuelo's case, like a particular quality of presence in the descriptions of her later life. People who knew her in the years with Jacques described a woman who was there in a way that she had not been able to be at Blenheim, present in the room, present in the conversation, present in the specific texture of the afternoon, rather than partially occupied, always, with the management of an institution that required something from her that she had never quite been able to give it freely. The woman at ease was different from the Duchess of Marlborough, in the way that a person is different when they stop performing and start simply being. The change is not always visible in the specific details. She was still gracious, still elegant, still the product of an education that had made certain qualities permanently her own. But there was a quality of ease in it, a quality of arrival. Jacques Balsan was, by all accounts, a good person in the quiet, consistent way that makes a good person easy to overlook in historical narrative. He did not have great titles or great political consequence. He did not build anything that history would have particular occasion to record. He was an aviator who had been genuinely brave in the early years of flight, and who had then, in his middle years, simply been a good husband, present, interested, kind in the daily ways that daily kindness requires, which are more demanding than they appear from the outside. He loved her, apparently, without requiring her to be anything other than what she was. This had been unavailable to her for a very long time. But we are moving too fast through the later chapters of Consuelo's story, because the heart of the drama between the two sisters, the thing that this story has been building toward, slowly, with all the patience of a story that understands that the most important things take time, does not happen in the 1920s or the 1950s. It happens in the years between, in the complex middle of two lives that were running in parallel but at different altitudes, and in the ways that one woman's choices affected or were perceived to affect the other. The year 1906, the year of the formal separation, was also a year of significant change in Alva's life. Alva's marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt had ended in 1895, the same year as Consuelo's wedding, in a divorce that was itself a social event of some magnitude, not because it was the first divorce in the Vanderbilt family or even in New York society, but because Alva had handled it with the same strategic clarity she brought to everything, had obtained it on her terms, and had then, in a move that surprised everyone who had assessed her simply as a social climber, married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, who was interesting and unconventional, and who died in 1908, leaving Alva a widow of 55 with a great deal of money, a great deal of energy, and a revised understanding of what she had been doing with her life. The revision was the suffragist conversion. Alva threw herself into the cause of women's suffrage with the same organisational energy she had previously applied to the conquest of New York society, hiring speakers, funding campaigns, organising marches, lending her name and her resources to the movement with a commitment that went beyond gesture into genuine vocation. The conversion was, in its way, a reckoning. She was acting in the cause of women's right to choose in ways that acknowledged, without quite explicitly stating, that she had not always honoured that right in the choices she made for her own daughter. This is the strange and somewhat painful chapter of Alva's story, the chapter in which the principal architect of Consuelo's arranged marriage became a champion of women's autonomy. It is not a hypocritical story exactly. People do change. People do learn, even from the most fundamental of their mistakes, even when the learning comes too late to undo the damage. but it is a story that illuminates something about the self-serving nature of many conversions, about the way that people tend to arrive at progressive positions precisely in the areas where their own prior failures are most obvious. The suffragist Alva was, in some part, the woman who was trying to become worthy of the daughter she had wronged. Back to Edith. While Consuelo's marriage was unravelling in slow motion across the decade after the turn of the century, Edith was watching, and for the first time in the story of these two sisters, not simply watching. She was also deciding what her own life required, deciding what she owed to the family machinery, and what, if anything, she owed to herself. These decisions were slower and less dramatic than the corresponding decisions in Consuelo's life, because Edith was a slower and less dramatic person, but they were decisions genuinely made with genuine weight. The decision that mattered most was about power. Not power in the theatrical sense, not the power of a great title or a spectacular social coup. Power in the domestic institutional sense. The power of the person who manages the resources, who controls the social narrative, who determines what the family's public face will look like in a world that is changing faster than the family's internal assumptions have yet accommodated. Edith moved into this power gradually, in the way that a competent person moves into authority that is simply lying there to be picked up, not through seizure or conflict, but through the quiet accumulation of function. She organised, she managed. She was, in every gathering of the remaining Vanderbilt family, the one who knew who was where and what was needed, and who should speak to whom, and how the thing should be arranged. This is not a glamorous form of power. It does not involve palaces or international press coverage. But it is, in the long run, a durable form of power, the kind that outlasts the spectacular kinds, because it is built into the daily operations of the thing it governs. Edith moved into this power gradually, in the way that a competent person moves into authority that is simply lying there to be picked up, not through seizure or conflict, but through the quiet accumulation of function. She organised, she managed, she was, in every gathering of the remaining Vanderbilt family, the one who knew who was where and what was needed, and who should speak to whom, and how the thing should be arranged. This is not a glamorous form of power. It does not involve palaces or international press coverage, but it is in the long run a durable form of power, the kind that outlasts the spectacular kinds, because it is built into the daily operations of the thing it governs. It is worth pausing on what this kind of power actually requires, because it is the kind that is most consistently underestimated. To be the person who knows where everything is and how it works and what needs to happen next is to have made yourself indispensable in a way that no formal title or formal position can produce. Titles can be assigned and withdrawn, formal positions can be restructured away, but the knowledge that comes from being consistently present, consistently attentive, consistently the person who shows up and does the work, this knowledge becomes, over time, the foundation of an authority that is not easily removed because it is not externally conferred. It was built from the inside. It is the person herself. Edith had been building this from the beginning, from the schoolroom, from the season, from the years of watching her mother construct a social world with a clarity and a thoroughness that Edith had absorbed without fully sharing her mother's particular ambitions. She'd taken the tools of the Vanderbilt world and had used them not for conquest, not for the spectacular social victories that Alva had pursued, but for the quieter, more durable achievement of being genuinely necessary to the people around her, necessary and trusted and present in the specific way of a person who has decided that their value is going to come from what they do, rather than from what they have, or what they are called. The last light of the day falls through the lace curtain now in long pale columns that lay themselves across the floor with the quiet authority of light that knows it is running out. Let the light do its work. Let the room fill with that particular quality of early evening, not quite dark, not quite day, that makes everything look slightly more resolved than it did an hour ago. The story is finding its way toward its conclusion, as all stories eventually do. But we are not there yet. There are still the later years to move through, and the long, quiet denouement of two lives that were complicated in their middle, and that, in their endings, became something else. Something quieter, something that might, after everything that came before it, be called peace. There is a moment in the life of almost every complicated sibling relationship, and the Vanderbilt sisters' relationship was nothing if not complicated when something that has been accumulating below the surface for years comes up into the light. Not always in a dramatic confrontation, sometimes simply in a letter or in a report from a third party, or in the particular phrasing of something that is said at a family gathering, in a tone of voice that carries more weight than the words themselves. Think about how that kind of moment arrives. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive wearing the face of a crisis. It arrives wearing the face of an ordinary conversation, of a piece of ordinary information relayed in an ordinary tone, and it is only afterward, sometimes hours afterward, sometimes days, that you recognize what it was, that you identify, with the retrospective precision of the mind working on something it could not quite process in the moment, that what happened was the surface cracking, that what you had taken to be a casual remark was actually the visible portion of a very large thing that had been building for a very long time underneath. For Consuelo and Edith, that moment arrived in connection with the question of their mother. Alva Vanderbilt had, by the first decade of the 20th century, become a figure of considerable complexity in the family's internal life. She had overseen the management of Consuelo's marriage and its consequences. She had, in the years since the separation and the divorce proceedings, revised her views, had come, it seemed to those around her, to regret the part she had played in placing her younger daughter in a situation that had caused her sustained unhappiness. She was also, by this point, deeply involved in the suffragist movement, which was itself a form of revision, a way of acting on new understandings, however belated they had arrived. There is something almost too neat about Alva's suffragism, the woman who had orchestrated the most famous forced marriage of the Gilded Age becoming one of the movement's most vocal and financially generous supporters. The neatness is suspicious, in the way that dramatic personal transformations often are when they arrive with the convenience of a public narrative. But it is also possible that the neatness is not the result of calculation, that the revision was genuine, that what Alva Vanderbilt felt, watching her daughter's unhappiness play out over the years, was the specific and unmistakable discomfort of a person who has been wrong in a way that cannot be corrected, only acknowledged, only compensated for, only partially addressed through the doing of something that moves in the right direction even after the moment for the right choice has passed. This is a familiar kind of guilt because it is not the clean guilt of someone who did something in ignorance and then learned better. It is the more complicated guilt of someone who knew, at the time, who had been told, who had seen the evidence, and who chose the system over the child anyway. Alva had known that Consuelo did not want to marry the Duke. She had known it because Consuelo had told her so, clearly, more than once, had wept and pleaded, had named the other man she loved. Alva had known, and she had proceeded. The suffragist years were, whatever else they were, a form of sitting with that knowledge. The question of what Alva's relationship with each daughter looked like, and how the relationship with one affected the other, is a question that the historical record addresses incompletely. What is clear is that the two daughters related to Alva differently, which is not unusual, since children within the same family often develop different relationships with the same parent, and that this difference had a quality of asymmetry that created friction between the sisters. Edith had remained throughout the years of Consuelo's marriage and its unravelling in closer proximity to Alva. Not because Edith was more loyal, exactly, or more forgiving, these categories don't quite fit, but because Edith had stayed in New York, had stayed within the social world that Alva had built, had maintained the relationships and the forms of life that Alva had established as the correct ones for the family. Her marriage, however modest in Alva's original estimation, was still a marriage conducted within the parameters of the world Alva had shaped. She was still there. She was still, in the ways that mattered to a woman like Alva, present. There is something to be said for presence. It is not a glamorous quality, presence. It does not appear in the kinds of stories that get told about remarkable women of remarkable families, but it is a real form of contribution, and it carries its own weight in the emotional economy of a family. Someone has to be the person who is there. Someone has to be the daughter who attends the functions and manages the arrangements, and remains available for the conversations that can only happen between people who are in the same city, the same room. Edith was this person. She had been this person throughout the years of Consuelo's absence, and she had been it not reluctantly or resentfully, or not entirely, but because it was the role that her choices had made available to her, and because she was, by nature and by training, someone who took her roles seriously. Consuelo had left. And the leaving, the long trajectory of the failed marriage, the separation, the divorce, the remarriage to Jacques Balsan, the life in France, was not simply a departure from a specific domestic arrangement, but a departure from the family's entire project. It was, read through Alva's lens, an undoing of the thing she had spent decades constructing. Not entirely fair, as a reading. Consuelo's departure from Blenheim was the consequence of a marriage that Alva had forced, and Alva knew this. But human feelings are not required to be fair, and the feeling of being abandoned, even by someone you have wronged, is a real feeling. What makes it more complicated still is that the person Alva felt abandoned by had better reason than most to have done the abandoning. This is the particular anguish of the parent who has wronged a child, that the child's distance, earned and justified though it is, still feels like desertion, that the grief of having been wronged does not cancel the grief of the separation, that both griefs coexist, ungoverned by the logic that says only one can be valid at a time. The asymmetry became, in the later years of Alva's life, a source of tension between the sisters. Consuelo, in the decade before Alva's death, was not ungenerous toward her mother. She visited, she maintained the relationship, she eventually reached the kind of accommodation with Alva that required acknowledging the wrong that had been done without allowing that acknowledgement, to prevent the rebuilding of something functional between them. But the accommodation was not the same thing as the close proximity that Edith maintained, and the not-sameness of it was something that Edith, and then the people around Edith, occasionally articulated in ways that reached Consuelo's ears. The word used in some of these articulations was selfish. Consuelo was selfish. She had gone to France and married a Frenchman, and was living a pleasant life in the sun while the business of the family, the maintenance of the relationships, the management of the elderly Alva, the keeping up of all the complex social apparatus that constituted the Vanderbilt family's presence in New York, fell to Edith. Consuelo had escaped, and the price of her escape had been paid by the sister who stayed. The word landed differently than perhaps it was intended to. Not as a gentle nudge, not as a sisterly observation offered in a spirit of practical problem-solving. It landed with the weight of an accusation that contained within it a whole set of prior accusations, about what Consuelo had owed the family before she left, about what leaving had cost the people who remained, about whether a woman who had been placed inside a bad situation by the very system she had eventually fled was responsible for the debris that her departure left behind. This accusation, if we can call it that, and it seems right to call it something, landed differently on Consuelo than it might have on someone who had not spent decades examining the terms on which she had been placed inside the situation she had eventually escaped. Because Consuelo's understanding of her own life was that she had not escaped from a situation she had freely chosen. She had escaped from a situation she had been put in. The distinction between escaping from something you chose and escaping from something you were forced into is not a small one. The question of what you owe to your family, to your mother, to the sister who stayed, is a question that looks very different depending on which side of that distinction you're standing on. And there is, underneath the accusation, a different and perhaps more honest version of what Edith was expressing. Not simply that Consuelo owed more to the family than she had given, but that Edith's own sacrifice, her staying, her managing, her presence, had not been fully seen. That the labour of the sister who remained had been treated as the natural order of things rather than as a choice, and that this non-acknowledgement was itself a kind of injustice. Both things can be true, that Consuelo's escape was justified, and that the cost of it was borne unequally. The justice of the escape does not automatically distribute the costs of it fairly. And there is, underneath the accusation, a different and perhaps more honest version of what Edith was expressing. Not simply that Consuelo owed more to the family than she had given, but that Edith's own sacrifice, her staying, her managing, her presence, had not been fully seen. That the labour of the sister who remained had been treated as the natural order of things rather than as a choice, and that this non-acknowledgement was itself a kind of injustice. Both things can be true, that Consuelo's escape was justified, and that the cost of it was borne unequally. The justice of the escape does not automatically distribute the cost of it fairly. This is the knot at the centre of the sisters' later relationship. Two claims, both legitimate, that are structurally in conflict with each other. Consuelo's claim is, "I did not choose to be placed, therefore I do not owe the full price of my escape to the system I escaped from." Edith's claim is, whatever you did or did not choose, the work had to be done by someone, and it was done by me, and this deserves acknowledgement. Both claims are real. The conflict between them is not a conflict of good versus bad, but of two goods that cannot both be fully honoured at the same time. The good of having escaped an unjust situation, and the good of having faithfully managed the consequences that the escape left behind. Families are full of this kind of conflict, though they rarely involve stakes this high or circumstances this dramatic. The sibling who moved away and the sibling who stayed. The child who was favoured and the child who was not. The one who had advantages and the one who had to work harder for the same outcomes. These asymmetries accumulate over decades, unacknowledged at the time because acknowledgement would require a conversation that the family's ordinary register does not have room for, and then surface, in the tone of a remark, in the phrasing of a letter, in the slight tightening of a voice at a family gathering, and are recognised by the recipient as something that has been building for a very long time. She did not write about this in the memoir with directness. She wrote around it, acknowledging the complexity of her relationship with Edith without assigning blame, describing the different positions they occupied without characterising either as wrong. The generosity of the memoir extends to its treatment of everyone, including the people whose behaviour toward her was not generous. This generosity was not weakness. It was, in its way, a form of power, the power of a person who has arrived, through a long and difficult journey, at a place from which she can afford to be magnanimous. But between the memoir's lines, in the spaces between what is said and what is not quite said, the shape of the thing is visible. Two sisters who grew up in the same room, looking at the same window, were by the middle of their lives looking at entirely different landscapes. The one who had stayed was not without her own complications, her own resentments, her own sense that she had been doing the work that the world did not celebrate, while her sister's life was the one that got written about. And the one who had left was not without her own guilt, the persistent, low-grade, impossible-to-eliminate guilt of a person who knows that her freedom was purchased at a cost that was not entirely her own. This is the shape of the betrayal that the title of this story points to, not a single act, not a moment of treachery or a deliberate cruelty, but a slow, accumulative, structural thing, the betrayal of expectation, of the implicit contracts that siblings make with each other simply by growing up in the same house under the same pressures with the same resources available to them. Consuelo had used her resources to get out. Edith had used hers to get ahead, within the existing system. Each of them had, in doing so, changed the situation of the other. Each of them had, in some sense, left the other behind. The question of who betrayed whom, or whether betrayal is even the right word for what happened between two women, in a world that gave them very little choice about the lives they were going to lead, is a question that this story does not intend to answer definitively. Because the point is not the judgment. The point is the texture, the specific quality of what happened between two sisters navigating an impossible set of circumstances with the tools they had been given and the intelligence they possessed and the feelings that neither of them could quite say out loud. There is something in a window when the light through it is soft and the room behind you is warm and the story you have been inside for an hour or more has reached the place where everything is beginning to resolve. Something that invites a particular quality of attention, not the sharp attention of someone looking for something, but the softer attention of someone who is simply present, who has arrived at the moment of the story where you don't need to hold anything tightly anymore. Let that attention be yours now. The window is there. The light is there. The story is almost finished, but it is not finished yet. There are still the later years to move through, and the long, quiet denouement of two lives that were complicated in their middle and that, in their endings, became something else. Let the evening be still. Let the light fade very gradually, the way it does when you're not watching for it, so that one moment the room is pale and the next moment, without your having noticed the transition, it has become the soft grey of early evening. This is where we are, this is where the story is, and the going forward from here is slower and gentler and easier to carry. There is a quality of light in the long afternoons of late summer that belongs specifically to the years of one's middle age, those decades when the urgencies of youth have subsided and the urgencies of old age have not yet arrived, and the light itself seems to stretch and linger in the way that time does when it is not being pressed. This is the quality of light in which both Consuelo and Edith lived the substantial middle portions of their lives, Not the sharp high light of morning ambitions, but the long, golden, slightly dusty light of an afternoon that is generous with its time. Middle age for women of their era and their background was not the invisibility it has sometimes been described as. For women who had been deployed primarily as social and dynastic instruments in their youth, middle age brought something that youth had largely denied them: the authority that comes with having been present for a long time, with having accumulated the particular kind of knowledge that only experience produces, with having demonstrated through the simple fact of endurance that you were more than the uses to which your youth had been put. The currency changed. It did not disappear. For Consuelo, the middle years were spent primarily between France and New York. She and Jacques had a house in Aise, on the Côte d'Azur, a place of olive trees and lavender and the specific blue of the Mediterranean, a blue so different from the grey-green Atlantic of her childhood that it functioned almost as a symbol of how completely she had remade her world. They had friends who were artists and diplomats and intellectuals and people who were simply pleasant to know, a social life that was warm and various and not organised around a single obsessive principle in the way that the world of her upbringing had been. She continued her philanthropic work. The causes she supported reflected her understanding of her own experience. She gave to educational institutions, to organisations that worked with young women, to efforts that had something to do with the expansion of choices available to people who had historically had very few. This was not accidental. It was the natural philanthropy of someone who has been given, through the combination of good fortune and personal determination, a life that she found worth living, and who wishes to direct some of the resources of that life toward the enlarging of other people's possibilities. She continued writing, not just the memoir, which came later, but letters and occasional pieces and the general reflective writing of someone who has found language to be a useful way of making sense of experience. She was, in these years, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Not in the theatrical sense of the word, not bright-eyed and publicly effusive, but in the quieter, more durable sense of a person who has found a life that fits her. The happiness had the quality of something earned rather than given, and this gave it a solidity that the performances of contentment she'd maintained at Blenheim had never possessed. The south of France in those interwar decades had a quality about it that attracted a particular kind of expatriate, not the dissolute expatriate of legend, not the people drinking too much in cafes and conducting affairs and avoiding the consequences of their earlier decisions in other countries, but people who were genuinely in the process of building something, building a life, building a way of being in the world that did not depend on the specific coordinates of origin and inheritance that had shaped them. Consuelo moved in these circles with the ease of someone who had earned her place in them through experience, rather than claiming it through name. For Edith, the middle years looked different from the outside, though from the inside, to the extent that we can access the inside of Edith's experience. They may have had their own quiet quality of sufficiency. She remained in New York. She remained embedded in the social world that she had been raised in, though that world was itself changing around her in ways that sometimes required adjustment. The great houses of the Gilded Age were, by the 1920s and 1930s, beginning to disappear, sold, demolished, converted into apartment buildings or institutions, the mansions of the plutocracy becoming museums or libraries or simply rubble, the land beneath them yielding to the city's endless appetite for something more productive. Edith watched these changes from the inside of a world that was adapting to them. She was not by temperament a person who lamented. She was by temperament a person who assessed the available situation and determined the most intelligent response to it. The available situation was that the Gilded Age was ending, that the world her mother had ruled from the summit of the 400 was becoming history rather than contemporary life. The most intelligent response was to recalibrate, to maintain what could be maintained, to release with grace what could no longer be held, to find in the reduced circumstances of the later years the same quality of authority that the grandeur of the earlier ones had provided through different means. The Vanderbilt houses on Fifth Avenue were among the casualties. The great marble chateau that Alva had built, the house whose costume ball had forced Mrs. Astor to leave her card, the house where Consuelo had grown up watching the sky from the schoolroom windows, was demolished in 1926. In its place, a commercial building. This was not a tragedy exactly. It was simply the city doing what cities do, which is to replace the previous generation's idea of permanence with the current generation's, in an endless succession of replacement and reimagination. But there was something in the demolition of that particular house that functioned as a kind of period at the end of a sentence. The sentence of the Gilded Age itself, the sentence that had been running since the 1870s, and that was, by the 1920s, clearly drawing toward its close. The income tax had arrived, the Depression was coming. The world wars were in progress or approaching. The enormous fortunes that had built the mansions on Fifth Avenue were not going to be rebuilt on the same scale under the new conditions. The families who had held them were dispersing into smaller houses, into Europe, into the ordinary world of people who are comfortable but no longer operating at the scale of dynasties. The dynasty was becoming a family. The family was becoming individuals, and the individuals, each in their own way, were navigating a world that no longer had quite the same system of grooves and channels that had guided their predecessors so firmly through their lives. What was being lost, and it is worth pausing to name this, because the story of the Gilded Age is so often told as a story of excess that needs no mourning, was a certain kind of certainty, not the pleasant certainty, not the confidence of those who could afford not to doubt, but the structural certainty of a world in which the categories were fixed, in which everyone knew their position and the position was legible to everyone else, in which the rules were clear even when, perhaps especially when, they were unjust. That certainty was going. The world that replaced it was in many ways better, more just, more various, more open to the kinds of people it had previously excluded. But the loss of certainty is itself a form of loss, and the people who had organized their entire lives inside a particular structure of certainty felt its going, even when they were intelligent enough to acknowledge that the structure had been serving some people far better than others. Edith navigated this transition with the same steady competence that had characterized her navigation of everything else. She downsized with grace. She maintained her social position not through the display of resources she no longer commanded on the same scale, but through the social intelligence she had been building all her life, the knowledge of how to be the right kind of person in the right kinds of situations, which was a capital that did not depreciate in the way that real capital does. She was in these years a presence rather than a spectacle, a person you respected for what she was rather than for what she owned. The two sisters were in contact throughout these years. The correspondence continued. The letters remained careful, maintained in the register of their time, discussing practicalities, sharing news of the children. The children were now adults themselves, with children of their own, with lives that were in various stages of negotiating their own relationships to the family's legacy, touching occasionally on the larger events of the world, but always returning to the manageable scale of the personal. Letters are a particular kind of communication, slower than speech, more deliberate, better suited to the management of complex feelings, because the act of writing requires a decision about what to include that real-time conversation does not. Both sisters were careful correspondents. Neither of them was the kind of person who said everything she felt at the moment she felt it. The letters they exchanged were, in this way, representative of the relationship itself, careful, warm in a measured way, maintaining a register of civility and affection that allowed the complexity underneath to be present without being the only thing present. There were visits, not frequent but regular, the kind of visits that sisters make when they have reached an age where the urgencies that kept them separate for decades have softened, and what remains is the simple fact of a shared beginning. They had, after all, grown up in the same room. They had looked at the same window. They had been shaped by the same mother, the same house, the same set of expectations, the same world. Whatever had passed between them, the asymmetries, the accusations, the different choices and their different costs, they were, underneath all of it, two people who had started from the same place. This shared beginning is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the more durable things that human beings can have in common, not the dramatic shared experiences of conflict or adventure, but the quieter sharing of a formation, of an education received in the same room, of a window looked out of from the same angle, on the same mornings, toward the same piece of sky. The things that happened later, the divergence, the distance, the complexity, did not erase this. They were laid on top of it, the way layers of sediment are laid on top of older formations, and the older formations are still there, still solid, still capable of bearing weight. In their later years, when both sisters had arrived at the kind of age where the past is as present as the future, and the long perspective becomes available, they appear to have found something in each other that the middle years had made more difficult to access. A simplicity. The simplicity of two people who knew each other before they knew anything else, who had been formed in the same crucible, who had each, in their own way, survived. The world they had been born into was by now entirely gone. The Gilded Age was history, was the subject of books and museum exhibitions and the nostalgic attention of a later era, that found in those decades a quality of excess and ambition and spectacular failure that seemed to illuminate something about the nature of American wealth and its discontents. The mansions were demolished or converted. The social machinery had been disassembled or modified into forms its creators would not have recognized. Mrs. Astor was long dead. The 400 were no longer a concept that anyone used with a straight face. And two old women, in their different apartments and their different countries, were getting on with the business of finishing their lives. Edith in New York still. Consuelo in New York too by this point. She'd returned in her later years, drawn back by the city if not by the social world that the city had once contained. New York in the post-war years was not the New York of the Gilded Age. The Fifth Avenue mansions were gone. The Newport season had contracted to something more modest. The social register still existed, but it had the quality of an institution that knows it is more artifact than authority. The city had become, as it always does, something new, noisier and faster and more populous, full of people who had never heard of the 400 and would not have particularly cared if they had. This new New York was, in its own way, hospitable to both of them. To Consuelo, because she had never required the specific validation of the old social world, had indeed spent most of her adult life building something that existed outside it. And to Edith, because she had the kind of social intelligence that adapts to the available environment without losing its essential quality, that finds in any situation the version of the correct relationship that the situation allows. This new New York was, in its own way, hospitable to both of them. To Consuelo, because she had never required the specific validation of the old social world, had indeed spent most of her adult life building something that existed outside it. And to Edith, because she had the kind of social intelligence that adapts to the available environment without losing its essential quality, that finds in any situation the version of the correct relationship that the situation allows. The post-war world offered both of them something that the pre-war world had not, a degree of visibility for the kind of women they had become that the Gilded Age had not provided. The Gilded Age had been interested in women primarily as social and dynastic objects, as the wives and daughters and mothers whose beauty and breeding and management of households constituted their public significance. The post-war world was beginning, not completely, and not without resistance, to be interested in women as people who had opinions and histories and competences that were not merely decorative, that deserved to be engaged with rather than simply admired. Consuelo had spent decades building competences of exactly this kind. Her philanthropic work had made her someone with real knowledge of real problems, housing policy, educational access, the conditions of the rural poor. Her memoir, when it came, would not be received as the reminiscences of a pretty woman who had once been famous. It would be received as the reflections of a person who had thought seriously about her own experience and about what it illuminated regarding the broader experience of women of her generation. This was not a reception that the 1890s would have offered. It was the reception of a world that had, in the intervening decades, expanded its categories. Edith in this new world remained primarily herself, which is to say primarily a New Yorker of a certain class and a certain generation, embedded in the institutions of that world, valued for the specific kind of presence she represented. But even for Edith, the world had changed enough that the presence she represented was something slightly different from what it would have been in 1895. She was not, in the post-war decades, merely the exemplar of a social type. She was also a person with a history, a person who had made choices, sustained a life, navigated the same large changes that everyone of her generation had navigated, and arrived at her 7th and 8th decades with something that looked, from the outside, very much like the wisdom that long experience of a single world produces in a person who has paid attention throughout. They had survived it all. This is perhaps the most essential thing to say about both of them. Placed, managed, deployed in the service of a system that regarded them primarily as instruments, they had both found ways, different ways, with different costs, to become people rather than instruments, to exercise judgment about their own lives rather than simply receiving the judgment of others, to choose within the constraints that their world imposed, and to live with the choices they had made. The afternoon light holds in the room for a long moment before it begins its slow decline toward evening. There is no hurry in it. There is no urgency in any of this now. The story has done its work, has laid out its layers, has brought you this far through the Gilded Age and its aftermath, and what remains is simply the last of the light and the beginning of the quiet. Houses remember things, not in the way that people remember, not with the active, organising, narrative-making capacity of a mind that selects what to keep and what to discard. Houses remember passively, the way old wood absorbs the smells of the things that have been cooked and burned and lived within them, the way stone holds the wear of particular hands, of a particular kind of attention, applied regularly to the same surface over a long period of time. There is a warmth that comes off old wood in a room that has been heated by fire for a long time. Not just the warmth of the current fire, but the accumulated warmth of all the fires that have been lit in that hearth over the years, soaked into the wood of the mantelpiece and the floorboards and the doorframe until the room itself seems to hold a temperature that belongs to it regardless of the season. This is what houses do with the lives that are lived inside them. They hold the temperature of those lives, give it back slowly to the rooms, make the rooms feel inhabited in a way that no amount of furniture alone can produce. If you were to stand today in the rooms of the houses that still exist, the rooms where this story unfolded, you would be standing in places that have absorbed a great deal of the history that lies behind you now as you listen. Not all of the houses survived. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, the house with the schoolroom on the third floor, and the silk wallpaper in the hall and the staircase that curved up to the landing with the east-facing window. That house is gone. The land beneath it is occupied by something else now, something commercial and entirely indifferent to the lives that were lived above it 140 years ago. There is something to observe in this, in the fact that the house where the story began no longer exists, that the ground where Alva managed her social campaigns, where Consuelo watched the sky from the schoolroom window, where the sisters sat across from each other at lessons and learned in different ways the world's terms, that ground is now occupied by something that has no memory of any of it. This is not unusual. Most of the ground where history happened has been built over, ploughed under, repurposed into something more useful to the present. History occupies place only temporarily. What it leaves behind is not the place but the record of what happened in it. Blenheim survives. It is open to visitors, as Consuelo's Blenheim has been open to visitors for decades now. You can walk the rooms where she moved as Duchess, the great hall with its 45-foot ceiling, the green state rooms, the gallery that runs along the garden front, the private apartments where she and the Duke maintained their managed coexistence. The palace has been preserved with a thoroughness that the money now generated by its visitors and its wine and its hotels and its gift shops has made possible. It gleams. The stone is kept clean. The roof no longer leaks. The roof not leaking is, if you have read the memoir, a detail with particular resonance. Consuelo wrote about the roof with the specificity of someone who had felt its inadequacy in a personal way, who had understood, in the early years of her marriage, that the financial purpose she served in the arrangement was not merely dynastic prestige, but the physical maintenance of a building that was, without an infusion of American dollars, beginning to succumb to the English climate. The millions her dowry brought repaired the roof and the gutters and the windows and the floors. She made Blenheim weatherproof. This was her contribution to the argument the palace was making, the argument it had been making since 1705. She bought it another 100 years. If you stand in those rooms, if you have stood in them, if this is a place you have visited, you would perhaps have had the experience of finding it difficult to populate them in your imagination with actual human beings. The scale works against it. The ceiling is too high, the gallery too long, the proportions calibrated for statement rather than for habitation. You can admire it thoroughly and find it, even in admiration, slightly cold. This is not a criticism of the building. It is the building being exactly what it was designed to be. What it was designed to be was a monument to a victory, the victory of the first Duke of Marlborough over the armies of Louis XIV at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. That victory is what the building commemorates. Its scale and grandeur and the particular quality of its imposing on the Oxfordshire countryside are all in service of the memory of a military triumph that occurred almost 200 years before Consuelo arrived to become its Duchess. She was not married to a man exactly, she was married to a commemoration. This helps explain something about the quality of loneliness she described in those rooms. It was not simply the loneliness of an incompatible marriage, though it was that too. It was the loneliness of a person who had been placed inside a monument, who was expected to inhabit and maintain and enliven a building that had been designed not to be inhabited or enlivened but to impress. To show what a nation and a great family could produce when they applied the full weight of their resources and their ambition to a single act of architectural assertion. Think about what it means to live inside an argument. Every room you move through is making a claim. Every proportion, every ceiling height, every arrangement of windows is asserting something about the people who live here, about their significance, about the gap between themselves and the ordinary scale of ordinary life. This can be exhilarating for a time. It can even be comforting, the way large things are sometimes comforting. The way a cathedral is comforting, the way the ocean is comforting, the way enormity can, in certain moods, make the specific problems of a specific person feel temporarily small and therefore manageable. But you cannot live inside an argument indefinitely without beginning to feel the argument's demands, without beginning to understand that the building needs you, needs your youth and your beauty, and your American fortune and your willingness to perform the role of Duchess with sufficient conviction, in a way that has nothing to do with your own needs, your own preferences, your own quietly insistent sense that you are a person and not a prop. The houses of the Gilded Age in America were monuments in their own way, not to military victories but to the idea of American success, to the proposition that a nation without hereditary aristocracy could nonetheless produce a domestic magnificence equal to or exceeding anything that centuries of European privilege had managed. They were built in some part as arguments. They argued that the New World could do what the Old World had done, but bigger and newer and with better plumbing. And they were magnificent. Whatever one thinks of the world that produced them, the houses themselves are often extraordinary. But they are also, in the specific way of arguments made in architecture, inflexible. A house built as an argument cannot easily change its mind. A room designed to impress cannot accommodate the ordinary scale of a person who wakes up in it in the morning feeling ordinary. The Vanderbilt sisters both lived in houses that had been built to overwhelm the viewer, not to welcome the inhabitant. And both of them, in their different ways, eventually found that what they needed from a house was not grandeur but accommodation. The simple, unspectacular accommodation of a place that takes you as you are. Consuelo's house in Eze, the house in the south of France where she and Jacques spent the settled, happy years of their middle age, was nothing like Blenheim. It was a Provençal farmhouse, more or less, adapted and enlarged over years of living in it, to suit the rhythms of a life rather than the requirements of a statement. The walls were thick and cool, the windows were small and looked out on the olive trees. The room smelled of lavender that had been cut from the garden and hung to dry in the kitchen, and of whatever was being cooked in the kitchen below, and of the particular warmth of stone that has been absorbing the sun of the Côte d'Azur for a very long time. It was, by the standards of the world she had been born into, a modest house. By the standards of most people's lives it was generous and comfortable, and filled with the lovely things that a woman with means and taste accumulates over decades. But its scale was human. You could move through it without feeling reduced by the proportions of the rooms. You could sit in it at the end of an afternoon and feel that the house was sitting with you, rather than performing at you. This is what Consuelo had wanted, though she had not, at 19, had the vocabulary for it. Not the house, not this particular house, with these particular olive trees and this particular lavender, but the quality of it, the human scale, the sense of a place that was organized around her life rather than requiring her life to organize itself around the place. This is a thing that takes years to understand for some people, that the correct question to ask of a house is not whether it impresses but whether it fits. And it takes even longer, if you have been raised to believe that impressive is what houses are for, to understand that fitting is not a lesser thing but a truer one. Edith's houses in New York were less extreme than Blenheim in their grandeur, but they carried their own version of the same pressure, the pressure of maintaining the appearance that was expected of a woman of her position and her name. She managed this with her habitual competence. The houses were run well, the appearances were maintained, but there is, in the accounts of Edith's later years, a sense of a woman who had spent a very long time managing the interface between her private self and the requirements of her public role, and who was, in those later years, beginning to allow the interface to soften, to let something more essentially herself be visible in circumstances where earlier she would have maintained the performance more strictly. This softening was not a collapse. It was not the breaking down of someone who had held themselves together too long and could no longer. It was more like the natural relaxation of a face that has been held in a particular expression for a long time. Not a grimace, not a mask, but simply an expression that is no longer required, that can be released without loss and with something that might be relief. Old age does this for people who have been performing throughout their lives. It offers, if not permission exactly, then at least the practical opportunity of reduced stakes, the understanding that the consequences of letting your guard down are at a certain point considerably less dire than they were when you were 40, and the whole social apparatus was still running at full pressure, and every departure from the expected was a potential source of damage. By the time you're 70, by the time you're 80, the machinery has slowed enough that a small departure from the expected is just that. Small and momentary, and not worth the energy of maintaining the performance when the performance is no longer necessary. Old age does this for people who have been performing throughout their lives. It offers, if not permission exactly, then at least the practical opportunity of reduced stakes. The understanding that the consequences of letting your guard down are, at a certain point, considerably less dire than they were when you were 40, and the whole social apparatus was still running at full pressure, and every departure from the expected was a potential source of damage. By the time you're 70, by the time you're 80, the machinery has slowed enough that a small departure from the expected is just that, small and momentary, and not worth the energy of maintaining the performance when the performance is no longer necessary. What replaces the performance in people who have been performing for a very long time is not nothing. It is sometimes better than the performance, a more genuine version of the quality the performance was attempting to express. A person who has been performing warmth for 50 years sometimes discovers, when the performance relaxes, that there is genuine warmth underneath it, that the actor performing a virtue, over long years, can produce the virtue itself, can wear a channel in the self through which the thing can now flow naturally. Edith, in her later years, had the quality of someone who was being generous and sharp and present, without quite having to work at it, in the way that a musician who has played a piece 1,000 times begins to play it without thinking. Not more carelessly, but more freely, with the specific freedom of something so well learned it has become natural. Consuelo, in her later years, had a different quality. She had the quality of someone who had arrived at her authentic self not through the gradual relaxation of a performance, but through the active construction of something new, who had taken the self that the Gilded Age had given her, and, over the course of decades, built something alongside it that was genuinely hers. This is a different process than the relaxing of a performance. It is more deliberate, more costly, and in some ways more clearly visible in the result. The person Consuelo was at 80 was not the Duchess simplified, was not the Duchess with the performance stripped away. She was something that the Duchess had not contained, a person shaped by her own choices as much as by the choices that had been made for her. The houses remember. The rooms hold the warmth of the fires that were lit in them, and the impressions of the people who moved through them, and the weight of the years that were lived inside their walls. The schoolroom on the 3rd floor of the house on 5th Avenue held, in its floors and its walls and the wood of its desks, the particular quality of attention that 2 girls had brought to it, on a succession of mornings in the early 1880s. One of them watching the chalk, one of them watching the sky, both of them absorbing in their different ways the education that the room was designed to provide, and the education that it provided despite its intentions. The houses are mostly gone now. The fires that warmed them have been cold for a century, but the quality of attention, the particular way that 2 people looked at the same window from different angles and saw different things in the sky beyond it, that endures in the way that these stories endure, the way that what is written about those rooms and those mornings endures, in the telling, in the retelling, in the slow accretion of understanding about what it was like to live inside the Gilded Age's most beautiful and most constraining arrangements. And now the night is settling around us, the way nights settle in late autumn, not all at once, but gradually, the light going out of the sky 1 degree at a time, the room growing quieter, the sounds from outside becoming fewer and more distant. This is the natural rhythm of the end of the day, the rhythm that your body knows how to follow without being told. Let yourself follow it. The house around you holds its warmth. The story has given you what it has to give. In 1953, a woman of 82 published a book in New York. She was not by this point a particularly famous person. She had been famous once, very famous, in the decade of her wedding and the years immediately following, when the newspapers of 2 continents had printed her photograph and told her story with the enthusiasm that the press of that era reserved for the spectacle of American wealth meeting European title. But that was 58 years ago. She was, by 1953, a name from another century, and the world had other preoccupations. The book she published was called The Glitter and the Gold. It was, in the way that all the best memoirs are, a book about more than one person, about more than the author. It was a book about a world, about the Gilded Age and the particular experience of being a woman inside it, not the romantic version of that experience, not the version with the jewels and the ballrooms and the fairy tale quality that nostalgia sometimes brings to the mansions and the Newport summers. The real version, the one with the corset and the managed emotion and the feeling, persistent and difficult to name, of being a person whose personhood was secondary to her function. There is a kind of courage required to publish a memoir at 82, not the dramatic courage of someone young enough to have much to lose from revelation. The courage required at that age is quieter and perhaps more difficult. It is the courage of sitting down to look honestly at a very long life, at all of its accommodations and compromises, at the versions of yourself you constructed for different audiences at different times, and deciding to say what the experience was actually like rather than what it was supposed to be like. The memoir as a genre is full of people performing an honesty they do not quite possess. Consuelo's book does not belong to that category. She had spent years finding the words for this. The memoir was not a spontaneous production. It was the result of decades of reflection, of the long process by which a life that has been lived becomes a story that can be told. She had thought about it carefully. She had decided what to say and what to omit, and the omissions are sometimes as telling as the inclusions, the places where the prose goes briefly quiet, where a transition happens more quickly than the surrounding material seems to warrant, where the generosity that characterizes the book's treatment of everyone suddenly requires a small, additional effort to sustain. She wrote about her mother with a patience that felt earned, not the patience of someone suppressing a grievance. The difference is palpable in prose, and Consuelo was a good enough writer that she could not have maintained a performance of patience that was not rooted in something genuine. It was the patience of someone who had had long enough and experienced enough to understand that the people who shape our lives, even the ones who shape them badly, are themselves shaped people, formed by the same kinds of forces, operating inside the same kinds of constraints, acting from within a world that had given them a particular set of tools and no others. This is the most difficult thing that a person who has been wronged by a parent can arrive at. Not forgiveness in the clean, conclusive sense that the word sometimes implies, but understanding. Understanding that does not excuse the wrong, but places it in a context that makes it legible, that makes the person who did it recognizable as a human being with comprehensible motivations, rather than as a figure whose actions can only be explained by deficiency of love or character. Alva had loved her daughters. She had loved them in the specific, limited, constrained way that the world she inhabited had shaped her to love, a way that prioritized certain outcomes over certain feelings, that could override the evidence of suffering in service of the requirements of the system. This is a failure of a real kind. It is not, however, the failure of a person who did not love. She wrote about the marriage with a restraint that was its own form of eloquence. She did not describe the Duke as a villain. She described him as a man who was himself the product of a system that had shaped him as thoroughly as her own system had shaped her, that had taught him to value certain things and to be indifferent to others, that had made him capable of certain kinds of excellence and incapable of certain kinds of warmth. She was fair to him in the way that is most difficult to achieve, fairly without distorting in either direction, without the generosity that softens the truth or the acidity that sharpens it beyond what the truth requires. The Duke of Marlborough died in 1934. By the time Consuelo sat down to write the memoir, he'd been dead for nearly 20 years. Time is a necessary ingredient in this kind of fairness, the fairness that requires having lived long enough past the source of the grievance that the grievance has become history rather than present pain. She had the time, she used it well. The portrait she drew of the Duke is recognizable as a portrait of a real person, not a symbol, not a scapegoat, not a convenient villain for the narrative she was constructing. a person who found himself, like her, inside an arrangement that neither of them had designed, and both of them suffered from in different ways. The parts of the book that are most careful, the parts that require the most attention to read, are the parts about Edith. Not because Consuelo wrote badly about her sister. She wrote about her sister with the same careful fairness she brought to everything else. But the carefulness around Edith has a slightly different quality than the carefulness around Alva or the Duke. With them, the carefulness is the product of understanding, of having arrived, after long reflection, at a place from which she could see them clearly. With Edith, the carefulness has something else in it too, something that might be described as a continued uncertainty, as though the question of her sister was one that had not, even at 82, been entirely resolved. This makes sense when you understand what Edith represented in Consuelo's story. Alva and the Duke were historical figures. They had played their roles, and the roles were over. Their contribution to the arc of her life was complete. Edith's contribution was not complete. Edith was still alive. They were still sisters. Whatever had been complex between them was still, in some qualified sense, ongoing. And you cannot write with perfect equanimity about something that is still ongoing, regardless of how skilled a writer you are, and regardless of how thoroughly you have worked through the history of it. The reader who is paying attention notices, in the passages about Edith, a slight increase in the density of the prose. The sentences are slightly longer, the qualifications slightly more frequent, the pace slightly slower than in the surrounding passages. This is the texture of someone choosing her words with particular care, not because she's hiding something, but because she's trying to be accurate about something genuinely complicated. And accuracy about genuinely complicated things requires a different kind of effort than accuracy about things that are merely difficult. What she writes about Edith in the end is mostly kind. She writes about their shared formation, about the schoolroom and the lessons and the years in Newport, and the particular quality of their mother's presence in both their lives. She writes about the divergence of their paths with the descriptive precision of someone who finds the divergence interesting rather than merely painful, who can see, from the long perspective of 82 years, that two people starting from the same place and ending in different places illuminates something about the nature of choice and circumstance that a single trajectory could not. The memoir is more interesting because both sisters are in it. Consuelo knew this. The memoir was received, when it was published, with the respectful attention that the literary press of the period gave to the memoirs of distinguished women of a certain age. It was reviewed as a document of social history, as an insider's account of the Gilded Age from the perspective of one of its most visible participants. The reviewers noted its elegance, its restraint, its historical value. A few noted its emotional complexity, the way the beauty of the writing served to convey something that was not beautiful, the way the composure of the narrating voice allowed the reader to perceive, underneath it, the long life that had produced that composure. It was not a bestseller. It was not the kind of book that becomes a bestseller in 1953, which was a year preoccupied with other things, with the Cold War and the Korean armistice, and the coronation of a new queen in England and the general business of a world that was accelerating away from the 19th century's assumptions as fast as the 20th century's resources allowed. But it found its readers, and it has gone on finding them in the decades since, because what it describes is not merely a social world that has vanished, but a set of questions about what women are for, about the relationship between a daughter and a mother's ambitions, about the cost of beauty and of systems that deploy beauty in the service of dynasty that have not vanished at all. Edith read it. Of course she read it. Whatever her feelings were about it, and there must have been feelings, complex ones, reading her own life as it appeared in her sister's prose, she did not record them publicly. She was not a person who recorded things publicly. This was itself a difference between the two sisters, the one who found language for the experience and the one who held the experience in the more private vault of her own understanding, without translating it into words that could be read by strangers. Both methods have their costs and their compensations. Writing about a life, articulating it, organizing it into narrative, finding the language for the things that happened and what they meant, is a form of making peace with it, not simply accepting it, but actively engaging with it, turning it over in the light until you can see its facets. Consuelo had done this. The memoir was the evidence of the doing. Whatever unresolved things remained at its edges, The act of writing it had given her something that is available only to those who commit their interior life to language. The relief of having been understood, even if only by oneself. Both methods have their costs and their compensations. Writing about a life, articulating it, organizing it into narrative, finding the language for the things that happened and what they meant, is a form of making peace with it, not simply accepting it, but actively engaging with it, turning it over in the light until you can see its facets. Consuelo had done this. The memoir was the evidence of the doing. Whatever unresolved things remained at its edges, the act of writing it had given her something that is available only to those who commit their interior life to language, the relief of having been understood, even if only by oneself. There is something else the writing did, which the writer cannot fully control and cannot fully anticipate. It made Consuelo's experience available to people who had not lived it, to readers who were not Vanderbilts and had not been married to dukes and had no direct experience of Blenheim or Newport or the machinery of the Gilded Age's social world. And these readers found in the memoir something that they recognized, not the specific circumstances, which were not their circumstances, but the pattern underneath the specific circumstances, the experience of being shaped by forces outside one's choosing, of having a certain kind of life prescribed before one has had the opportunity to imagine it for oneself, of the long, difficult, ultimately possible work of arriving at something more genuinely one's own. This is why the memoir has continued to find readers in the decades since its publication. Not because the Gilded Age is a world that most readers inhabit or aspire to inhabit, but because the questions it asks, about agency and constraint, about what daughters owe their families and what families owe their daughters, about the relationship between freedom and the conditions that make freedom possible, are questions that remain alive in every era. They are asked in different vocabularies and in different circumstances, but they are recognizably the same questions, addressed to recognizably the same difficulty of being a person in a world that has already made a great many decisions about who you should be. Edith had not done this. Her form of making peace with her life was quieter, was conducted in the ongoing business of the life itself rather than in a separate reflective act. This is not a lesser form of understanding, it is a different form. Both sisters, in their different ways, had arrived by their 80s at a relationship with their own lives that was, if not serene, at least sustained. Both were still present. Both were still, in their different modes, themselves. The book sat on a shelf in a library in New York, and in other libraries in other cities, and in the homes of people who had read it and kept it. It sat in the way that books sit when they have done their work and are waiting for the next person to find them. Patient, unremarkable from the outside, holding everything they contain behind a cover that gives nothing away. Someone walking past it on a library shelf would see a modest volume with a simple title, would perhaps note the date of publication and the elegance of the binding, might or might not take it down. And if they took it down and opened it and read the first page, they would find themselves almost immediately inside a world that was very different from their own and yet recognizable in the ways that matter, the ways that have to do with the relationship between freedom and obligation, between love and duty, between what you are and what you are required to be. The pages yellowed very gradually in the way that the pages of all books yellowed, not becoming less legible, just less white, acquiring the particular warm tone of paper that has been present through decades of seasons and temperature changes and the slow oxidation that time applies to everything organic. The words inside the pages stayed the same. Words are more durable than almost anything else, more durable than the houses where they were written, more durable than the people who wrote them, more durable than the world the words describe. They simply sit in their sentences, patient and precise, waiting for the person who will open the page and read them, and find in them the particular resonance that a reader finds in a book that is saying something true. Let the book sit on its shelf now. Let the evening quiet settle around it. The story it contains is finished, but it is not over. It is the kind of story that goes on being read, that goes on finding new people to sit with it, in the particular quality of attention that this kind of reading requires. Slow, patient, unhurried, with all the time in the world. You are very still now. The story has been long, and the listening has been its own kind of work, and the work is done. There is nothing left to attend to. There is no next chapter. The house is quiet in the way that only late night makes a house quiet. Not the silence of absence, which is thin, but the silence of rest, which is full and warm and layered with the breathing of everything that shares it. The garden outside the window is dark now. The roses are closed. The leaves have stopped moving. The sky above the garden has that particular quality of the late-night sky, in a place where the city lights are not too close, not quite black, not quite anything you have a word for, just a depth of darkness that goes on beyond the trees. The clock ticks. One breath. One tick. One slow breath. One slow tick. The warmth of the old fire in the old stone. The softness of the air in this particular room, at this particular hour, in the quiet that is yours. Everything you were holding, the names, the houses, the sisters, the mothers, the marriages, the long complicated history of two women making their way through a world that had very particular ideas about what they were for, all of it is growing lighter now, not gone, just lighter. The way things become lighter when you stop holding them and let them rest beside you, let them settle into the air of the room, let them be present without requiring anything from you. The lace curtain does not move, the garden does not move. The clock ticks once more very quietly, and then the space between ticks grows longer, and the warmth in the room grows more general, less located, more like the warmth of the air itself than the warmth of any particular source. You are already most of the way there. You have been most of the way there for some time now. The story has been taking you down its long, slow corridor of rooms, one after another, each one a little quieter than the last, each one a little warmer, each one a little more deeply settled into the particular stillness that is the destination. The destination is here. The destination is now. It is the space between one breath and the next, between one tick and the next, between the last word of the story and the first moment of the sleep that was always waiting at the end of it. The room is still. You are still. The old house around you holds everything gently, the way houses hold the people inside them, without grasping, without effort, simply present, simply warm, simply the walls and the floor and the ceiling and the air that carries the last warmth of the fire and the faint green smell of the garden on the other side of the glass. Sleep well, the story is complete, the night is long, and there is nothing more that needs to be done tonight but rest. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. I'd love to know, do you have a favourite era of American history that you find yourself returning to? The one that feels most vivid or most distant or most strangely familiar? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone.